You wake up before the light, not because of some noble instinct or a disciplined lifestyle honed by years of rigorous self-improvement, but because the sound of your neighbor choking on phlegm 3 hovels over is indistinguishable from the scream of a dying pig. And that is more effective than any rooster. You stretch your body, your joints issuing a familiar symphony of reluctant cracks as your limbs resist their fate, and you stand up from the damp pile of straw that barely insulates you from the hard-packed earth below. Your toes instinctively curl, searching for the least offensive patch of ground to accept their weight. The rush of cold air that slips through the gaps in the wooden slats of your home gnaws at your skin before the day has even begun, before the sun even considers showing its reluctant face. You stumble outside, where the village is still more shadow than shape, the outlines of people and things defined less by what they are and more by what they are not. It is the hour when reality is malleable, when a stick leaning against a wall could just as easily be a demon's leg, when a pile of rags might not be rags at all. You walk the familiar path toward the stream, the same path you walked every morning of your life, since you could walk at all, and yet the same unease curls in your stomach, like it always does. You remind yourself that nothing has changed in the night, that the woods are not closer than they were, that the trees haven't shifted positions to follow you, but you keep your eyes on the ground anyway, on the black shapes that might be roots or snakes or something else entirely. The stream is where everyone begins their day because it is the only place that can offer water without sickness, though even that is questionable depending on how far upstream the cattle are grazing or how recently someone's child relieved themselves in the reeds. You kneel by the edge, cupping your hands, your fingers so dirty they barely resemble skin anymore, and as you lower them to the water, something stops you. A glint, a flicker. You blink. But there it is again, a pale oval shape in the dark liquid, hovering just beneath the surface, framed by the irregular ripples of the water, disturbed by your own breath. You lean closer, squinting, and then it happens. You see your reflection, except you don't know it as that. Not really. You have no concept of what a reflection truly is beyond vague, inconsistent notions. That still water sometimes shows things that aren't really there. That lakes are dangerous because they pull things in. That mirrors are for nobles and witches and sinners. But here, in this cold trickle of a stream at the edge of everything you've ever known, you see something that looks like a face, a grotesque, shifting mass that mimics your every movement with unsettling precision. You jerk back instinctively, your heart snapping awake, a quick intake of breath lodging sharp against your ribs as you look around to see if anyone else has witnessed this transgression. But of course, there is no one who will accuse you, at least not directly. But the woods might whisper about you later, or the crows might mutter your sin to the priest. You've been taught, in no uncertain terms, that water can reveal things that should not be seen, that reflections are not just images but doors, and sometimes traps. Your grandmother once told you that looking too long into still water would pull you inside it, that you'd be left with only your body on the bank, moving, talking, but empty, a vessel with no soul. She told you this as she chopped onions with a blunt knife, and you remember how her gnarled fingers trembled as she warned you never to stare too long. You had always laughed at that story when you were younger, when your bravado was still intact. But now, kneeling alone in the half-light of a pre-dawn mist, you aren't so sure. You lean in again, slower this time, forcing yourself to hold your ground, to see it clearly. The pale, irregular shape framed by dark water and flecks of algae, the wide-set eyes that seem both familiar and wrong, the mouth that barely moves yet somehow follows every twitch of your own lips. Your teeth are crooked. You never really knew that before. No one has ever told you what you look like, not precisely, and the vague gestures of other people. Your nose is like your father's, or you have your mother's brow, never quite coalesce into an actual image. Mirrors are not for the likes of you. They belong in distant, impossible cities, where artisans pay men to grind metal into thin plates or blow glass into silvery sheets, where wealthy women in silk robes admire themselves for hours, or so you've heard, until they forget who they are and become trapped in their own images, caged birds with bright, useless feathers. You, by contrast, have only ever known your face through sensation, through the ache of your jaw when you chew on the leather scraps of last winter's pigskin, through the sting of slap across your cheek when you drop a basket of turnips, through the crust of sweat and soil that builds up every day and never fully leaves, no matter how many times you plunge your hands into the stream. And now, here, you meet it for the first time, and it is monstrous. Your skin looks as though it is made of clay, streaked with grime and pitted with the scars of a dozen infections that no one ever named. Your hair is an unidentifiable mass, matted and dark, curling where it shouldn't and flattened where it should lift. Your eyes are hollow and rimmed with shadows, and for a moment you wonder if this is really your reflection at all, or if it's one of the water spirits your neighbor warned you about last winter when her goat disappeared overnight. She said the river took it, and that it would take one of us next. You know you should stand up, that the others will soon arrive with their buckets and their morning complaints. But you are pinned there by something stronger than fear. Curiosity, maybe, or the first dull bloom of self-awareness. You mimic a grimace and watch as a thing in the water grimaces back. You tilt your head. It follows. You whisper your own name, half as a test, and the echo of your voice seems to stir the reeds around you. For a moment, it feels as though the entire world is holding its breath, waiting to see whether you will cross some invisible line. And then the water shifts, breaking the fragile symmetry. A fat frog leaps in the bank with a wet, indifferent plop, sending concentric circles outward to fracture the image entirely. Your face is gone, replaced by 1,000 shivering fragments of light and mud and movement. You exhale a sharp, involuntary sound that is more relief than anything else, and you rise to your feet, wiping your hands on your already filthy tunic. But as you turn to leave, you hesitate, glancing back at the spot where your reflection had been, as if expecting to see it still there, lingering like a ghost that has decided to haunt you now that you've acknowledged it. The water is still again, but you don't dare look closely a second time. Not today. Perhaps not ever. You shoulder your empty bucket and begin to walk back up the path, your feet making familiar indentations in the soil, your body performing the same mechanical rituals it has always known. But something is different now, an almost imperceptible shift inside you, like the faint ache that comes before fever. You've seen yourself, or something like yourself, and you can't unsee it. That image, the sallow skin, the hollow eyes, the uncertain line between the real and the reflected, has lodged itself somewhere deep within your chest, where neither prayer nor penance can reach. As you pass the huddled shapes of your neighbors emerging from their hovels, you resist the urge to tell them what you saw. You know better. Words are dangerous as mirrors themselves, and the last thing you want is for some old crone to accuse you of consorting with dark forces, or worse, for the priest to summon you for a conversation about vanity and sin. So you keep it to yourself, burying alongside all the other things you never speak of. The night terrors, the dreams of drowning, the suspicion that your reflection is not just a passive mimic, but an active observer, waiting for the right moment to replace you entirely. By the time you reach your hovel again, the sun has finally crested the edge of the hills, bleeding its indifferent light across the village, turning the morning mist into golden vapor that is beautiful only from a distance. Up close, it smells like manure and rot. You sit on the threshold of your home, your bucket beside you, your hands still damp with the residue of the stream, and you stare at the ground, thinking about the face you saw. You wonder how many others in the village have seen themselves like that. How many of them carry the same silent, nameless dread you now bear. And then, as you listen to the chorus of coughs and the creak of wagon wheels and the indistinct murmur of yet another day beginning, you understand something you hadn't before, that you will never again be entirely certain of where you end and where your reflection begins. The days are long but indistinct, measured not by clocks. You have never seen a clock, but by the slow choreography of sun and shadow across the filthy walls of your hovel, the bone-chilling fog that signals dawn, the hot stench of livestock that signals noon, and the shrill cries of children being beaten into sleep that signal night. Time is an ache rather than a measurement, a heaviness that nests in your joints and your stomach, sometimes lifting when the bread is soft or the rain stays away, but mostly settling deeper, calcifying into habit. It is in one of these timeless days that the black mirror enters your life. Not in the literal form of obsidian or polished glass, of course, because you could never afford such sorceries, but as an idea, a warning woven into the fabric of your mind like the prayers you mumble without thought or hope of divine intervention. It begins with a story, as most terrors do. You are sitting near the communal fire pit, The one where villagers huddle for warmth and pretend not to notice when someone's hand slips into someone else's pocket or when another child fails to return home after a trip to the woods. The old men whose skin is as thin and translucent as onion peel sit on their stools carved from fallen logs, their voices brittle but relentless as they repeat the tales they've been telling for decades. They tell these stories not for entertainment but for survival, as a way to pass down the rules that keep you all alive, or at least not dead quite yet. It is during one of these long, thick evenings that you first hear about the Black Mirror. A man named Edric, whose fingers have been permanently curled into useless claws by frostbite from a winter no one else remembers, leans forward and with his toothless mouth describes a thing you can hardly comprehend. A slab of glass, black as pitch, smooth as ice, and colder than either. In his story, a woman, always a woman. These stories never damn men. Looks into this black mirror and sees not herself but her death. She sees her face decomposing, skin sloughing off like meat left too long in the sun, eyes clouded and milky, hair falling in greasy clumps. And because she has seen it, she cannot escape it. Within 7 days, or sometimes 3, depending on who is telling the story, she dies in exactly the way the mirror promised, her body twisted and bloated, her mouth open in a scream that no one hears because, as Edric is fond of repeating, the Black Mirror doesn't just show your death, it steals your voice so you can't warn anyone. The villagers listen, half believing, half amused, but you sit stiff and breathless because you remember the stream, the pale flicker of your own face staring up from the dark water, and how for just a moment it looked not like you but like a skull, a white oval swimming beneath the surface, too smooth and too hollow. You do not ask Edric where this mirror can be found, or why anyone would be stupid enough to look into it if they knew what it could do, because you already know that the question is not about the object, but about the temptation. The old men tell these stories to remind you that curiosity kills. Not metaphorically, not in some literary or allegorical sense, but literally, tangibly, in a way that a misstep on a frozen path breaks your leg and a festering wound ends your life 3 weeks later while you scream yourself hoarse in the dark. For days afterward, you can't go near the stream without thinking about the Black Mirror. You force yourself to avoid looking into the water directly, focusing instead on the dull, practical tasks of filling buckets or rinsing your clothes. But the image of that smooth black surface lingers in your mind, grafting itself onto every shadow and puddle until you feel as though you are surrounded by reflections even when none are present. The very idea that a reflection can not only mimic but predict, that it could betray you by showing not your current form but your future decay, unsettles you more than the usual litany of fears. Wolves, starvation, plague. Those things are outside forces, enemies to be fought or fled. But the mirror, whether black or clear, is something you carry within you, a potential traitor embedded in your own features. One evening, as you sit by the fire again, this time with a small hunk of stale bread gnawed down to the hardness of bone, a younger man named Aldrich, who has never seen a city and yet claims to know everything about them, starts bragging about how in Constantinople they have entire walls made of mirror glass. He claims that the nobility can look at themselves from every angle all at once, that they preen like peacocks in these rooms of endless reflection, and that no one ever dies there because they can see death coming from all directions and therefore know how to avoid it. Edric scoffs at this and spits into the fire, but Aldrich persists, insisting that mirrors are not curses but tools, and that the only reason they bring death here is because peasants like you don't know how to use them properly. The others laugh, throwing bits of dried dung at him until he retreats to the far edge of the firelight, but you sit in silence, considering the possibility. Could it be that mirrors are not inherently evil, but merely misunderstood? Could it be that your fear of reflections is not a universal truth, but a local superstition, a small-minded lie perpetuated by people too poor or too frightened to know any better? The thought excites and terrifies you in equal measure, leaving a sour taste in your mouth that no amount of stale bread can wash away. That night, you lie awake on your straw pallet, staring up at the thatch roof as the wind claws at the gaps and the rats scratch their ceaseless, invisible trails and corners. You think about the Black Mirror, about the woman who saw her own death, about the possibility that seeing such a thing might give you power rather than doom. But then you remember your grandmother's face, gaunt and collapsed like a tent abandoned in the rain, as she told you not to look too long into still water. You remember how she died, alone in her hovel, eyes open and mouth twisted, as though she had seen something at the last moment that no one else could see. And you wonder, with a new and creeping horror, whether it was her own reflection that killed her, whether she too once knelt at the stream and saw something she could not escape. The next morning, you force yourself to approach the stream alone, leaving your bucket behind, so that you have no excuse to pretend this is about water or chores or anything other than what it is, a confrontation. The surface of the stream is placid, almost unnaturally so, as though it has been waiting for you, preparing itself for your return. You kneel at the edge, your knees sinking into the soft, cold mud, and you stare directly into the water without flinching. At first, you see nothing but vague shapes, the shadows of trees and stones twisted by the slight current. But then, as your eyes adjust, you begin to see yourself, or what you think is yourself. A pale face, hollow eyes, a mouth slightly open as though in mid-breath or mid-scream. You lean closer, your breath stirring the surface, creating ripples that fracture the image into shards before slowly reassembling it like a puzzle you are both solving and becoming. You search the reflection for signs of death, for the hollowed cheeks of starvation, for the blotches of plague, for the gaping wounds of violence. But all you see is what has always been there, what you've always carried but never acknowledged, your own mortality, etched into the lines of your face, nestled in the faint sag of your skin, lurking behind the dull glaze of your eyes. And then, as though the stream has sensed your inspection and grown tired of your arrogance, the surface shifts without warning. A fish, perhaps, or a breeze, and your reflection is gone, replaced by the dark, inscrutable swirl of water moving endlessly towards some distant, unseen place. You fall back onto the bank, your hands clutching at the wet earth, your chest heaving not from exertion, but from the overwhelming realization that the reflection you saw is both inevitable and inescapable. Whether the black mirror is real or not is irrelevant. The truth is simpler and more brutal. You will die, and one day your face will be nothing more than an image someone else remembers or forgets. You rise to your feet slowly, your legs unsteady, your mind struggling to process the enormity of what you have just confronted. The villagers continue to tell their stories, to warn of mirrors that steal souls and reflections that predict doom. But you understand now that the true horror is not in the mirror itself, but in the fact that it reflects what is already there, what has always been there. You walk back to the village in a haze, your body moving out of habit, your mind somewhere else entirely, trapped in that moment by the stream, staring into the black mirror of your own mortality. And though you say nothing to anyone about what you saw or what you felt, you carry it with you, tucked deep beneath your ribs like a second heart. The knowledge that every reflection is a glimpse of the inevitable, that every surface capable of showing your image is also capable of showing your end. From that day forward, you avoid still water when you can, and when you cannot, you look away quickly, telling yourself it is out of practicality, out of superstition, out of respect for the old stories. But in truth, it is because you know now what the black mirror truly is. Not an object, not a place, not even a legend, but a condition of existence itself. The Lord rides through the village only twice a year, and both times the earth itself seems to bow under the weight of his presence, as though even the mud and stones know their place in the hierarchy. You hear the procession long before you see it. The creak of leather straps, the muffled clop of hooves on a sodden path, the sharp bark of commands from a throat accustomed to being obeyed without question. By the time the figures emerge in the morning mist, your heart is already tight in your chest, not with fear, though there's always that, but with a peculiar cocktail of awe and revulsion that the sight of nobility always inspires in you. They are not like you, not simply in wealth or power, but in essence. They seem made of different stuff entirely, as if the same God who fashioned you from the muck of this earth took extra time with them, layering their bones in privilege and wrapping their sinews in arrogance. The Lord himself is astride a horse, so massive it looks like a creature from the old stories, a beast that could devour wolves and trample men without breaking stride. But it is not the horse that holds your gaze, nor even the fine embroidery that gleams faintly on the Lord's cloak, though you cannot help but marvel at the audacity of wearing something so obviously impractical for a ride through your filth-stained village. No, it is the armor that transfixes you, the polished breastplate that catches a dim, reluctant light of the overcast sky and sends it hurtling in sharp, clean beams across the muck and grime of your world. You have never seen such a surface before, never encountered metal so smooth and lustrous that it behaves like water frozen in place. The armor is not simply protection. It is a mirror, one so perfect that for a moment you think you see yourself within it, distorted by its curvature but undeniably there. You move your head slightly to one side, and the ghostly figure in the armor does the same. A flicker of recognition passes through you, followed immediately by a flush of shame, as though you have witnessed something you were never meant to see. The Lord does not notice you. He does not notice any of you. The peasants who line the path in sullen, obligatory deference, heads bowed not from respect but from a hard-learned instinct to avoid attracting attention. The armor is not for you. It was never for you. It is for other nobles to admire, for enemies to fear, for chroniclers to immortalize in tapestries and crude woodcuts that will circulate in markets you will never visit. Yet here you are, standing ankle-deep in shit and straw, momentarily reflected in a surface so impossibly pure that it seems to mock the very conditions of your existence. You are acutely aware of your own body in that moment, of the dirt encrusted beneath your fingernails, of the sour tang of sweat and unwashed wool that clings to you like a second skin, of the perpetual ache in your lower back from hauling sacks of turnips and chopping wood for fires that never seem to provide enough warmth. In the bright, cold gleam of the armor, all of that seems heightened, made more grotesque by contrast. The man inside the armor does not share your burdens. His hands are soft beneath their gauntlets. His back is straight and unbent by toil. His reflection is whole and unblemished, while yours is warped, fragmented by the uneven surface of the breastplate and by the simple fact that your life affords you no place where your image could ever exist in its entirety. You have heard stories, of course, whispered by travelers or muttered by your own kin after too much ale, about the great halls of the nobility, where walls are lined with metal so polished that one could see oneself from head to toe without distortion. They say that the rich and powerful admire themselves for hours in these gleaming surfaces, practicing their smiles and perfecting their postures, rehearsing the roles they must play at court as though life itself were some endless, self-referential performance. To you, such tales have always sounded absurd, not because you doubt their truth, but because you cannot imagine the luxury of being able to look at yourself that long without recoiling. In your world, reflection is accidental, incidental, something that happens when water stills unexpectedly, or when a pot is cleaned more thoroughly than usual. It is not a daily ritual, not an affirmation of self, but a reminder of your own marginality, of how little your appearance matters in a life dictated by survival and obedience. There are no mirrors in your hovel, no polished metal plates reserved for vanity. The closest thing you have is the occasional glimpse of yourself in the dull sheen of a cooking pot, and even that is more abstraction than image, a vague suggestion of a face rather than its accurate portrayal. Yet here, in the gleaming expanse of the Lord's armor, you see yourself more clearly than you ever have before, even if only for a second, even if only as a distorted phantom trapped within the curved confines of a breastplate that was never meant to acknowledge your existence. It is not just the clarity of the reflection that unnerves you, but its context. The realization that this polished surface is designed primarily for war, for killing, and that your fleeting image within it is less a recognition of your humanity than an accidental byproduct of technology developed for destruction. You think about the irony of that, about how the only time you can truly see yourself is in a surface meant to repel swords and arrows, a surface that signifies death more than life. The armor does not care about you. It reflects indiscriminately, catching light and shadow alike without judgment. But you care, and in that moment of unwanted recognition, you feel both seen and erased simultaneously, as though your reflection confirms your existence even as it underscores your irrelevance. The procession passes, leaving behind a churned path of mud and hoof prints and a faint metallic scent that lingers in the air longer than the sound of the horse's hooves. The villagers disperse slowly, muttering about taxes and conscriptions, about the likelihood of another levy this year, or whether the Lord's son will be as cruel as his father. You stand rooted to the spot, staring at the place where the armor had just been, as though hoping that your reflection might somehow have been seared into the air itself, preserved beyond the brief moment of its appearance. But of course it is gone, as fleeting and insubstantial as mist, leaving you with nothing but the memory of having seen yourself through the eyes, or rather, through the armor, of someone whose life could not be more alien to your own. You walk back to your hovel in a daze, your thoughts tangled in contradictions you cannot untangle. Part of you resents the Lord for possessing such a surface, for having the means to own something that can reveal reflections so clear and precise. Another part of you envies him, not for his wealth or power, but for his access to an image of himself that is unbroken, whole, complete. That night, as you sit by the dim, sputtering fire, you catch your reflection once again, this time in the greasy surface of the pot you are scrubbing with a handful of straw. It is a miserable likeness, stretched and blurred, your features twisted into a grotesque parody of themselves by the irregularities of the metal and the soot that refuses to be scrubbed away. You stare at it for a moment, then turn the pot over and set it aside, unwilling to engage further with the mockery of your own face. But the memory of the armor remains vivid in your mind, a cold, hard mirror that you cannot touch but that has nonetheless touched you in a way no other surface ever has. You think about how the Lord rides through your village twice a year, always in that armor, always gleaming and impassive. And you wonder if he ever considers what it must be like to see oneself reflected not in a tool for grooming, but in an instrument of war. You wonder if he notices the faces that appear in his breastplate as he passes, if he sees the fleeting, distorted images of the people over whom he rules, or if those reflections are as irrelevant to him as the mud that splashes up against his boots. You suspect that he does not notice, that to him the armor is simply what was designed to be: protection, intimidation, a symbol of status. But for you, it is something more, something that has left an indelible mark on your understanding of yourself and your place in the stratified, indifferent world. You realize now that reflections are not merely about vanity or self-knowledge. They are about power, about who has the means to see themselves clearly and who must make do with fragments and distortions. As you lie down on your straw pallet, pulling your threadbare blanket over your shoulders against the encroaching chill night, you close your eyes and see again the gleam of the armor, the sharp, cold light slicing through the mist and catching your face in its metallic embrace. And though you know that the Lord will return in 6 months, bringing with him the same procession of horses and banners and polished steel, you also know that you will never again see yourself reflected so clearly, so cruelly, as you did in that brief, accidental encounter with the mirror of his breastplate. You drift into sleep with that image burned into your mind, a reminder that in this world, even something as simple as seeing your own face is a privilege you can neither afford nor escape, and that the rare moments when you do glimpse yourself are as much a revelation as they are a condemnation. And as the rats resume their nocturnal scurrying and the wind howls through the gaps in your walls, you wonder what it would be like to live in a world where reflections are not accidents but rights, not warnings but comforts, and you understand, with a clarity that is both painful and profound, that such a world is not yours and likely never will be. You have never seen Venetian glass, but you have heard of it, the same way you have heard of the sea or the stars in the southern sky, as things that exist more surely in stories than in life, things too exquisite and rare to ever cross the threshold of your coarse, work-hardened world. The word itself, Venetian, lands on your ear with the same foreign weight as gold or silk or spices. All these things the merchants and pilgrims mutter about when they pass through the village with their dusty boots and guarded eyes, men whose every possession is either too precious or too dangerous to name out loud. You listen to them as you squat by the roadside, hands buried in the same gray mud you've known since birth, pretending not to care, pretending that your life has not changed in some fundamental, irreversible way every time a stranger with a story or a relic walks by. It is from one of these men that you first hear the phrase Venetian glass, uttered with a reverence usually reserved for saints or relics. He is a peddler of dubious wares, dried herbs, cracked pots, a chipped comb missing more teeth than it possesses. But even he straightens his back and lowers his voice when he speaks of the glassmakers of Venice, those legendary artisans who conjure windows and mirrors so fine and so pure that they capture light itself, trapping it like a bird under glass, taming its wildness and forcing it to perform. He claims that in Venice they blow the glass by mouth, shaping it with fire and lung into delicate vessels as thin as a maiden's sigh, and that their mirrors are polished so perfectly that they show not merely a reflection but the truth, the very soul of the one who dares to look. You cannot even begin to comprehend what such a thing might look like. Your experience with glass is limited to the rough, bubbled panes that cover the tiny windows of the manor house, where they warp the light into strange, viscous shapes that crawl across the ground like spilled honey. Those windows do not show the outside world so much as a hint at it, offering distortions of sky and branch that seem more like hallucinations and images. To think that there are men somewhere in the world who can make glass so clear, so flawless, that it can reflect a person's face without warping it, without mocking it, is almost too much to bear. The peddler says that a single sheet of Venetian glass, no larger than your palm, is worth more than all the livestock in your village combined. And you believe him without hesitation. You know that in the world of things, value is not determined by utility, but by rarity and desire. A cow feeds a family but costs little because everyone is one, or at least everyone who matters. But a mirror of pure glass, made in a city so distant that even the merchants have a squint when they point to it on a map, that is priceless not because of what it does, but because of what it represents. Mastery over nature, over fire and sand and breath itself. You ask the peddler, against your better judgment, what it feels like to look into such a mirror. He pauses for a moment, weighing whether to indulge you, and then he smiles in that way adults do when speaking to a child who will never understand. He tells you that it is like seeing yourself for the first time, like realizing that all the years you have spent glancing at your reflection in puddles and polished metal were not real, were only shadows of what a reflection could be. In a true mirror, he says, you cannot lie to yourself. You see every flaw, every wrinkle, every hesitation etched into your features, as though the glass has stripped away not just the grime and the distortions, but even your intentions, leaving only the bare, irreducible fact of your being. You thank him with the proper politeness. Then go home and lie awake for most of the night, staring at the ceiling of your hovel and tracing the imagined contours of this mythical mirror in your mind. You think about what it would mean to see yourself without distortion, without the merciful blur that water or tarnished metal provides. Would you even recognize that face? Would it resemble the creature you have always known yourself to be, or would it expose something entirely foreign, something you have kept hidden even from yourself? The next morning, you go to the stream as you always do, but this time, when you lean over to fill your bucket, you force yourself to look directly at the water, daring it to show you something new, something truer. But of course it doesn't. The surface is as unreliable as ever, dappled with the shadows of leaves and the glint of a passing insect's wing, and your reflection is fractured by every ripple and eddy, reduced to a collage of broken shapes that barely assemble into a face. You are reminded once again of your place in the hierarchy of existence. The nobles may own their polished metal plates, the merchants their Venetian glass, but you are left with mud and water and the occasional accidental glimpse of yourself in the dull curve of a pot. Over the next few weeks, the story of the Venetian glass begins to curdle inside you, fermenting into a quiet, persistent ache that you carry with you as you work the fields, as you tend the livestock, as you repair the endless rents in your threadbare clothing. It is not that you believe you will ever possess such a thing. Your life is too narrowly circumscribed for that fantasy. But the knowledge of its existence has unsettled something in you, has introduced the unbearable awareness that there are versions of the world you will never access, layers of experience closed off to you not by fate, but by the accident of your birth. You begin to notice reflections more acutely than you ever have before, seeking them out in places you once ignored. The puddles in the road after a rainstorm, the sheen of sweat on a horse's flank, the faint glisten of oil on the surface of a bowl of stew, all become moments of involuntary self-recognition, opportunities to glimpse yourself, however imperfectly. But each time, you are confronted not with clarity, but with distortion. Your face stretched and warped, your features bent into grotesque approximations of themselves by the irregularities of the surface. One evening, as you are helping to repair a section of the manor's boundary fence, a punishment for some infraction you don't even bother to remember, you catch sight of yourself in one of the small, cloudy panes of glass embedded in the manor's windows. The image is faint and fragmented, your face barely more than a smudge on the surface, but it is enough to make you pause, hammer suspended in midair. You lean closer, pressing your forehead almost against the cold glass, and for a moment you can almost imagine what it must be like to look into Venetian glass, to see yourself rendered in perfect fidelity. But then the steward's voice snaps you out of your reverie, ordering you back to work, and you step away from the window, heart pounding with a mixture of shame and longing that you cannot quite name. That night, you dream of a room filled with mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of yourself. Some young and strong, others old and broken, some clothed in fine robes, others naked and shivering. You wake in the dark, sweating and gasping. Your fingers claw at the straw you're bedding, as though trying to hold on to the images before they dissolve completely. The following day, you find yourself returning to the peddler, seeking him out at the edge of the village where he has set up his miserable stall. You ask him, again against your better judgment, if he has ever actually seen Venetian glass with his own eyes. He laughs, not cruelly, but with the resigned amusement of someone who had been asked the same question too many times before. He admits that he is not, that everything he knows comes from the stories of others, passed along from one mouth to another until the truth becomes irrelevant, replaced by the seductive power of the idea itself. You realize then that Venetian glass may be less an object and more a myth, a symbol of everything you've been taught to desire but can never possess: beauty, clarity, self-knowledge. It is a perfect reflection, the unblemished surface that reveals not only who you are, but who you could be, if only you live in a different time, a different place, a different body. The peddler packs up his wares and moves on, leaving you alone with this realization, with the bitter knowledge that the mirror you seek exists only in stories, that the truth of yourself will always be mediated through surfaces that lie and distort. As you return to your daily life, the ache does not fade but settles into a kind of resigned acceptance, a dull companion that walks beside you as you chop wood, mend fences, and kneel by the stream. You stop seeking reflection so eagerly, recognizing futility of the pursuit, but you also find that you cannot entirely forget the idea of Venetian glass, cannot entirely banish the image of that perfect, merciless mirror from your mind. In the quiet moments, when the village is asleep and the only sounds are the lowing of cattle and the distant rustle of the forest, you imagine yourself standing before such a mirror, your reflection unbroken and whole, your face illuminated not by the flickering light of a dying fire, but by the steady glow of something cleaner, purer, more absolute. And though you know that you will never see such a thing, never touch its cold, flawless surface, you take a strange, grim comfort in the knowledge that it exists somewhere, that in some distant room in a distant city, someone is looking at themselves in a way you never will, and that their gaze, too, is filled with longing and dread. You do not remember precisely when the woman began to be called a witch, only that one day she was a weaver's daughter, quiet and pale and given to walking alone by the river at dusk, and the next day she was something else entirely, something darker, more dangerous, a name whispered with spittle-flecked caution at the communal well, or muttered behind closed shutters when the wind howled through the village like the voice of God's own anger. It is not that she changed, not really. Her movements remained the same. Her voice retained that low, uncertain cadence, and her face, so rarely revealed without the veil she wore wrapped tightly around her head, was as thin and unreadable as ever. But something shifted in the way others looked at her, as if they had all, simultaneously, seen her step once, just once, beyond the threshold of what was acceptable, and now she was marked forever. You remember the exact moment when you, too, began to see her differently, though you would never admit it aloud. It was early spring, the kind of day when the mud is just beginning to give way to patches of hard-packed earth, and the air smells faintly of thawing rot. You were walking along the riverbank, returning from your morning of setting traps in the woods, when you saw her there, kneeling beside the water with her veil pulled aside, her long fingers carefully adjusting it so that it fell across her brow just so. For a moment, you thought she was praying, her posture so still and deliberate, but then you realized that she was looking into the river's surface, leaning in closer and closer until the very tip of her nose nearly brushed against the water. She did not seem to notice you, or if she did not care, and you stood frozen a few paces away, unsure whether to retreat quietly or announce your presence. But then she did something that made your blood run cold, something that cemented her transformation from peculiar to dangerous in your mind. She smiled at her reflection, not a wide, indulgent grin, not the sort of fleeting, self-conscious smirk you might make when you catch sight of yourself unexpectedly, but slow, deliberate curling of the lips, as though acknowledging an old friend or sealing a pact. You had never seen anyone look at their own reflection like that before. In your world, to catch your image in water was a moment of brief, often unsettling recognition, not something to be courted or savored. But here she was, caressing her veil into place, smiling softly at the river's surface as though it held a secret only she understood. You left without making a sound, your heart pounding in a way that felt disproportionate to the simplicity of the scene you had just witnessed. But even as you trudged back to the village, The image remained lodged in your mind like a thorn, her pale face hovering just above the dark water, her expression serene and distant, her fingers moving with the grace of someone who was not afraid of what she saw reflected there. Over the following days, you found yourself glancing toward the riverbank whenever you passed by, half hoping and half dreading to see her there again. But she did not return, at least not when you were watching. Then the rumors began, as they always do in places like this, where boredom and fear are as much a part of the air you breathe as smoke from the cooking fires. First, it was that she spoke to the river spirits, then that she had been seen gathering herbs by moonlight, herbs that no decent woman would touch. Someone claimed that their child had fallen ill after playing too close to her house. Someone else said that a fox had been found dead in the woods with its eyes missing, and surely that was her doing. The accusations grew in scope and absurdity, but they all circled back to one central, damning observation. She had been seen looking at herself in the river, not once but many times, always alone, always at dusk, always with that same strange, knowing smile. It was not vanity that condemned her, for vanity was a sin reserved for the wealthy who could afford mirrors and fine clothes and the leisure to preen before them. No, it was something far more insidious. The suggestion that she was using the river as a mirror for some darker purpose, that her reflection was not merely an image but a tool, or worse, a collaborator. The priest spoke of such things sometimes, in those long, rambling sermons where he warned of the devil's tricks and the many ways Satan might ensnare the unwary. Mirrors, he said, were portals, gateways through which demons could slip into the world. And to seek out your own reflection, to stare too long into it, was to invite corruption into your very soul. And so the village's suspicion hardened into certainty, as it always does when people are afraid and in need of something or someone to blame. She was a witch, they decided, and her crime was not merely whatever imagined hexes or curses she had woven in the privacy of her home, but her open, unapologetic intimacy with her own reflection. You did not defend her, though a small, uncomfortable part you wanted to, for reasons you could not fully articulate. Instead, you remained silent, watching from the edges as the others began to avoid her house, crossing themselves whenever they passed it, whispering about what should be done. You saw her one more time, quite by accident, a few weeks after the rumors had reached their fever pitch. You had gone to the river again, this time to clean a rabbit you had trapped. And as you knelt by the water, your hands slick with blood, you looked up and saw her standing further down the bank, her veil once again pulled aside, her face once again turned toward the water. But this time she was not smiling. This time her expression was unreadable, her eyes distant and unfocused, as though she were looking not at her own reflection, but at something beneath it, something only she could see. You watched her for a long moment, unnoticed, then turned back to your work, gutting the rabbit with practiced efficiency, though your hands trembled slightly as you did so. When you looked up again, she was gone, vanished into the trees as silently as she had appeared. You did not tell anyone about the encounter, though you knew instinctively that it would confirm all their worst suspicions, would provide yet more fuel for the fire they were already so eager to light. It was not long after that the decision was made. No one said outright, but you could feel in the air, in the tense silences and the quick, sidelong glances exchanged at the well, and the way the men began gathering in small, secretive groups, their voices low and urgent. And then, one morning she was gone. Her house stood empty, the door ajar, the meager belongings inside scattered as though in haste or violence, and no one claimed to know where she'd gone, though the older women nodded grimly and said that such creatures always disappear when their time is up. You walked past her house that day, as you always did on your way to the fields, but you did not look inside. You did not want to see what was, or wasn't, there. Did not want to confront the possibility that something had happened beyond the simple, silent departure the others prefer to believe in. But when you reached the river later that afternoon, when you knelt to wash the dirt and sweat from your face, you found yourself looking into the water, half expecting to see her face there beside your own, hovering just beneath the surface like a ghost or a warning. But of course there was nothing, only your own reflection, warped and flickering as always, eyes hollow and mouth set in that same grim line you had worn since childhood. You splashed the water against your skin, shivering as the cold bit into you, then stood and walked away without looking back. But even as you moved through the familiar paths of your daily life, You carried the image of her at the river, her veil loose, her face open to reflection, and you wondered, in the quiet spaces of your mind where no one else could intrude, what it was she saw there that made her smile, what truth or promise or doom had been waiting for her in that dark, shifting surface. In the weeks that followed, the village returned to its routines, as villages always do after such purges, the collective memory smoothing over the jagged edges of what had been done until it became just another story. Another cautionary tale to be told in hushed tones to children who might one day stray too close to their own reflections. But for you, the memory did not fade so easily. It lingered, heavy and insistent. A reminder how thin the line is between the familiar and the forbidden, between the harmless act of adjusting a veil by the river and the unforgivable crime of acknowledging your own reflection in a world that demands you remain unseen, unknowable even to yourself. And though you never spoke of it again, not to anyone, you knew that you would carry that moment with you always. The woman by the river, the smile, the reflection, the silent, inescapable recognition of what it means to see and be seen in a world that punishes both with equal ferocity. The monk arrived in the village as all such men do, abruptly, as if conjured out of thin air, and carrying with him the vague, unsettling odor of distance, a mixture of sweat and old parchment, of candle wax and the mildew that comes from sleeping too many nights in drafty cloisters or under the cold belly of hedgerows. He was not the first monk you'd ever seen, nor, you suspected, would he be the last. They passed through often enough, hunched figures in coarse robes, muttering Latin invocations under their breath, as though afraid their own words might betray them. But there was something different about this one, something in the way he walked with that slow, deliberate gait, as though the earth itself resisted him, or perhaps he resisted the earth. His hood was drawn low over his brow, casting his face in shadow even at midday, and his hands, clasped in front of him, were as pale and bloodless as wax. He came, as they all did, to beg and to bless in equal measure, to offer prayers in exchange for bread, and a place by the fire, to dispense grim warnings about the wages of sin before slipping silently away to the next village, where the cycle will begin anew. But what you remember most about him, what you will never forget even after every other detail of his visit dissolves into the amorphous haze of your days, is the story he told about the mirror, the cursed mirror that, once broken, condemns its breaker to 7 years of misfortune so relentless and inescapable that death itself comes as a mercy. You were sitting by the communal fire as usual, your legs stiff from a day spent hauling stones to repair the crumbling walls of the northern field, your hands still raw from the rough rope you had used to lash the load together. The monk sat across from you, perched on a low stool that creaked ominously beneath his gaunt frame, his robe pooling around his feet like a shroud. The villagers had gathered in the expectant silence that always accompanied the arrival of the stranger with stories, their faces illuminated by the jittering dance of flames, eyes wide not with wonder, but with a grim anticipation of yet another cautionary tale. He began slowly, in that deliberate cadence peculiar to men who speak more often to God than to other human beings, his voice thin but steady, threading its way through the smoke and the whispered prayers and the low crackle of the fire. He spoke of a mirror unlike any other, forged in an age so ancient that even the monks who wrote the most exhaustive chronicles of the world dared only to allude to it obliquely, as though naming it outright might invoke its malice. This mirror, he said, was not made of simple glass and lead like the crude reflective plates possessed by the wealthy, nor was it a polished metal surface dulled by time and breath. No, this mirror was different. It was perfect, flawless in its clarity, capable of capturing not just the image but the very essence of anyone who dared look into it. And because it was perfect, it was dangerous. The monk described how those who gaze into the mirror would see not only their own features rendered in merciless fidelity, but also their secrets, their sins, their hidden desires and unspoken fears, all laid bare beneath the cold, indifferent surface. No imperfection could be concealed. No lie could withstand the mirror's absolute truth. It was, in his words, a tool of divine judgment masquerading as an object of human vanity. And yet despite, or perhaps because of its terrible power, men coveted it, sought it out with a kind of desperate longing usually reserved for relics or lost loves. They believed foolishly that to possess such a mirror was to possess control over their own reflection, to master the image they presented to the world. But as the monk reminded you with a slow shake of his hooded head, No man can control the truth of himself, and those who tried invariably found themselves broken instead. He told of one such man, a noble of great renown and greater pride, who acquired a mirror at great cost and who, in a fit of rage upon seeing something in its depths he could not abide, something, the monk hinted darkly, that had more to do with his own soul than his face, shattered it with the hilt of his sword. But the breaking of the mirror did not free him from its judgment. It only scattered it into countless shards, each one retaining a fragment of the whole, each one carrying a sliver of the curse. And so it was, the monk intoned, that the man was condemned to 7 years of misfortune for every shard that remained, for every piece that he failed to gather and bury in consecrated ground. 7 years for each fragment, a multiplicity of curses that compounded until his life unraveled entirely. His lands withered, his servants deserted him, his children succumbed to sickness one by one, and finally, he himself was found dead in a ditch, his body broken in ways that suggested no accident, but rather the deliberate malice of forces unseen. At this point in the story, the monk paused, as though weighing whether to continue, and then, after a long breath, he leaned forward and in a voice barely louder than the hiss of the fire warned that the mirror's shards are still out there, scattered across the world, hidden in the most unlikely of places. He said that it is not uncommon for someone to stumble upon a piece without even realizing it, perhaps mistaking it for a bit of glass in a riverbed or a polished stone in the forest, and that should one be so unfortunate as to catch their own reflection in such a fragment, even for a moment, the curse would awaken anew, claiming yet another unsuspecting soul for its ceaseless tally. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks into the night air, and for a moment no one spoke. You sat motionless, your hands clenched so tightly around your knees that your knuckles ached, your mind racing with the implications of what you had just heard. You thought of all the times you had leaned over the stream to wash your hands or drink, of the fleeting moments when you had caught your distorted image rippling in the water's restless surface. Could one of those moments have been a fragment of the cursed mirror? Could you have already doomed yourself without even knowing it? The monk, sensing the unease he had stirred, straightened and folded his hands in his lap, his voice resuming its familiar, indifferent cadence as he moved on to other matters. The need for repentance, the importance of avoiding the snares of vanity and pride, the virtues a humble life lived in obedience to God's will. But you scarcely heard any of it, your thoughts still trapped in the labyrinth of his earlier story, winding endlessly through the possibilities, the fears, the half-formed superstitions that had suddenly been given shape and substance. Over the next few days, the monk lingered in the village, offering blessings to those who sought them and hearing confessions from those who could no longer bear the weight of their own guilt. You avoided him as best you could, slipping quietly past whenever you saw his hunched figure moving through the lanes or standing at the well. You did not want to look into his face, did not want to see in his eyes a confirmation of what you already suspected, that the story it told was not just a parable, but a warning meant for you personally, that you were already entangled in the mirror's curse. And yet, despite your best efforts, you could not stop thinking about it. Every time you approached the stream, you hesitated, standing on the bank for long, agonizing moments before forcing yourself to kneel and complete whatever task had brought you there. You began to avert your gaze as you leaned over the water, focusing only on your hands, on the bucket, on the fish traps, anything but your reflection. But of course, you could not avoid it entirely. There were always those unguarded moments when the water stilled unexpectedly, when the surface smoothed just long enough for you to catch a glimpse of yourself, pale and hollow-eyed, hovering just beneath the ripples like something already half-drowned. The monk left the village as abruptly as he had arrived, disappearing down the rutted path toward the forest without so much as a farewell. Life, as it always does, resumed its familiar rhythm. The dawn brought work, the evening brought exhaustion, and the nights brought the same restless sleep punctuated by dreams you could never quite remember. But the story lingered, woven now into the fabric of your days, a quiet, insistent presence that colored every interaction with the river, every accidental glance into a puddle, every fleeting encounter with your own image. And though you never spoke it to anyone, not to your family, not to the other villagers, not even in the privacy of your own prayers, you carried the story with you always, folded tightly within the secret places of your mind like a shard of glass tucked into the lining of a garment, sharp and hidden, waiting for a moment when it might finally cut through. You understood now. As you had not before, that reflection was never merely a matter of vanity or curiosity, but a dangerous, precarious act, a negotiation with forces beyond your comprehension or control. And so you learn to move through the world with a new kind of caution, always wary of smooth surfaces, always alert to the possibility that any innocent glint of light might in fact be the gleam of a fragment of that ancient, cursed mirror, lying in wait to claim yet another soul for its endless, merciless sentence of misfortune. The word refinement does not exist in your vocabulary. Or if it does, it is a concept that applies only to people so far above you in station that their lives might as well belong to another species altogether, one that walks more upright, speaks in softer, more carefully modulated tones, and, most impossibly of all, sees themselves with a clarity that you will never be allowed. You have come to accept that reflection itself as a kind of privilege, one afforded only to those whose lives contain enough leisure to indulge in the contemplation of their own image. For you, reflection is not an act but an accident, not a moment of intentional recognition, but something that happens despite your best efforts to avoid it. A glance into the ripple of a muddy puddle as you cross the field, the briefest shimmer on the surface of a ladle as you dip it into the cooking pot, the distorted smear of your face barely perceptible in the sooty metal of a plowshare. But for the nobility, reflection is as intrinsic to their existence as breath. You have seen it, glimpsed it in fleeting moments when you were permitted, or rather required, to enter the manor house to deliver bundles of firewood or baskets of harvested root vegetables. Inside that cold stone fortress, there are objects you can scarcely comprehend, things that seem to serve no practical purpose but to assert their owner's dominion over both nature and other men. Tapestries depicting battles from centuries past, pewter vessels embossed with intricate scenes of courtship and conquest, and most strikingly of all, polished metal plates, some small and handheld, others mounted onto walls, whose sole function, as far as you can tell, is to offer their owners a way to see themselves rendered in something approaching fidelity. You remember the first time you caught sight of such a plate. You had been sent to the manor with a sack of onions, your hands still raw from scrubbing dirt from their stubborn skins, your back aching from the long hours spent hunched over the furrows. The steward, a small, officious man with an unnerving habit of sniffing before every sentence, led you to the grand hall. His muttered complaints about the quality of this year's produce trailing behind him like the faint smell of mildew that always clung to his robes. As you pass through the hall, your eyes inevitably wander from the cold flagstones beneath your feet to the walls above, where one such metal plate hung between two heavy velvet drapes. Its surface was so bright, so perfectly polished, that it seemed to emanate its own light, catching and reflecting the weak afternoon sun that filtered through the stained glass windows high above. For a moment, you did not recognize what you were looking at. The figure that stared back at you from the plate's merciless surface was at once familiar and alien. The hunched posture, the dirt-caked tunic, the gaunt face framed by unkempt hair. It took you a long, confused second to realize that it was you, that the metal had captured your likeness with a precision and clarity you had never experienced before. You stood there, transfixed, as though rooted to the cold stone floor, unable to look away from the spectacle of your own reflection made manifest in this improbable object. It was the steward's voice, sharp and impatient, that finally snapped you out of your reverie, his nasal command to hurry along, breaking the spell and sending you scurrying forward, your heart pounding in your chest with a strange mixture of shame and exhilaration. You left the manor that day with your hands empty but your mind full, haunted by the memory of that reflection, of the version of yourself that the polished metal had revealed. So much clearer, so much crueler than the fragmented glimpses you caught in your daily life. In the weeks and months that followed, you found your thoughts returning again and again to that moment, as though your mind had become its own kind of reflective surface, trapping and replaying the image with maddening insistence. You thought about how, in your world, the act of seeing oneself was something to be avoided, an indulgence that bordered on the sinful, a temptation that risked drawing unwanted attention or inviting superstitious accusations. But in the manor, reflection was not only accepted but expected, woven into the very fabric of noble existence, a daily ritual as routine and necessary as prayer or feasting. You imagine the lady of the house standing before that very same metal plate each morning, adjusting her elaborate coif, inspecting her pale, ring-laden hands for any blemish, scrutinizing her own face for the slightest sign of age or imperfection. You pictured the lord polishing his armor until it gleamed like liquid silver, then pausing to admire the fearsome image of himself refracted across its curved surface, ensuring that his appearance would convey the appropriate blend of authority and menace. And you understood, with a clarity that made your chest ache, that for them, reflection was not merely about appearance but about identity, about confirming and consolidating their place in the social order. The polished metal plates, the gleaming armor, the intricately framed mirrors rumored to exist in far-off courts. All these things were not passive objects, but active instruments of power, tools that allowed the nobility to see themselves as they wished to be seen, to cultivate an image of superiority that was then projected outward onto the world, and by extension, onto people like you. Their reflections affirmed their difference, their separateness, their inviolable distance from the lives of toil and deprivation that defined your own existence. For you, by contrast, reflection was a fleeting, accidental, and often disorienting experience, one that offered no affirmation and little comfort. When you caught sight of yourself in the ripple of the stream or the sheen of a wet stone, you did not see an identity to be embraced, but a body to be endured, a fragile, fallible vessel worn down by labor and hunger and time. You did not linger over these images, did not seek them out, did not polish surfaces in anticipation of them. You simply acknowledged them in passing, as one might acknowledge a sudden gust of wind or the distant roll of thunder, an occurrence that had no bearing on your ability to complete the day's tasks. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of this difference, you found yourself increasingly obsessed with the idea of the noble reflection, with the polished surfaces that captured and preserved images so precisely, so permanently. You wonder what it would be like to see yourself render without distortion, to have access to a reflection that did not warp your features beyond recognition, or reduce your image to a fragmented, ephemeral ghost. You wonder whether such clarity would bring you closer to understanding who you really were, or whether it would only confirm your deepest fears about your own insignificance. One afternoon, as you walked past the manor on your way to the fields, you caught sight of one of the younger noble sons standing in the courtyard, his polished breastplate catching the sunlight in a blinding flash. He was inspecting his reflection in the metal with an air of casual entitlement, adjusting the angle of his helmet, tilting his head first to one side and then the other, ensuring that every detail of his appearance met his own exacting standards. You watched him from the shadows of the hedgerow, your fingers unconsciously tightening around the handle of your spade, your chest tight with an emotion you could not quite name. It was not envy, exactly, though there was certainly some of that, nor was it purely resentment, though that too played its part. It was something more complicated, a kind of sorrow tinged with longing, a recognition that this simple act, the act of seeing oneself clearly, was a privilege that would never be yours, a daily ritual that was for you, forever out of reach. You turned away before he could notice you, hurrying down the path toward the fields, your thoughts heavy and tangled, your eyes fixed firmly on the ground, as though to avoid any accidental glimpse of your reflection in the puddles left by the morning rain. That evening, as you sat by the fire, your muscles aching from the day's labor, you found yourself staring into the dark, reflective surface of the cooking pot, watching as the flickering light from the flames danced across the warped, uneven metal. For a moment, you thought you saw your own eyes staring back at you, hollow and distant, barely distinguishable from the shadows that surrounded them. You reached out instinctively, as though to smooth the surface, to coax the image into greater clarity, but your callous fingers only smudged the soot and left a reflection even more obscured than before. You sat back with a sigh, pulling your rough woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders as the night air crept into the cracks and walls, and you wondered, as you often did these days, whether it was better not to see oneself clearly at all, whether the comfort of ignorance might outweigh the harsh revelations of a perfect reflection. You thought of the nobles and their manner, of the lady adjusting her veil before the polished plate, of the lord admiring his own image in the gleam of his sword, and you wondered whether their reflections ever betrayed them, whether they ever saw on those flawless surfaces something they did not wish to see. But you knew, deep down, that they did not. Their reflections were curated, controlled, and most importantly, reinforced by the world around them, by the deference of peasants, the obedience of servants, the approval of their peers. Your reflection, by contrast, existed only in the moments when you could not avoid it. in surfaces that mock rather than affirmed, in glimpses that unsettled rather than consoled. And so you resolved, as you sat there by the dying fire, to avoid such moments whenever possible, to keep your eyes fixed on the tangible, immediate task of survival rather than the elusive, often cruel pursuit of self-recognition. But even as you made this resolution, you knew that it was one you would inevitably break, that you would continue to seek out your reflection in spite of yourself, drawn by the same inexorable, irrational impulse that compels all living things to seek confirmation of their own existence. The priest's sermons were not meant to be listened to, not really. They were meant to be endured, much like the rain or the long winters or the occasional outbreak of boils that swept through the village every few years, reducing both livestock and human beings to silent, weeping husks. You sat through them as you always did, not out of reverence or even fear of God, though fear was certainly an element, but because to not sit through them was to invite suspicion, to mark yourself as a potential heretic, a potential problem, and problems in the village had a way of being solved swiftly and permanently. The priest stood at the front of the dim, damp church, his voice rising and falling in rhythms as familiar as your own heartbeat, invoking the usual litany of sins and punishments, virtues and rewards, his words spilling into the air with the inevitability of smoke from the nearby hearth. But on this particular Sunday, he spoke not of greed or envy or even most popular of all village sins, sloth, but of vanity, and he did so with fervor and precision that made even the most seasoned sinners among you shift uncomfortably on the hard wooden benches. Vanity, he declared, was the root of all decay, the seed from which grew not only personal ruin but communal collapse, a sin so insidious that it could be committed in the very act of simply acknowledging one's own reflection. You sat straighter at that, your ears pricking in the thick, incense-sodden air, your gaze drifting up to where the priest stood beneath the battered wooden crucifix, his long, bony fingers gripping the edges of the pulpit, as though the words he was unleashing required physical restraint. He told the story of Narcissus, though he did not use that name, for he spoke not in the gentle cadences of myth, but in the sharp, accusatory tone of ecclesiastical warning. There was, he said, once a man who loved himself so much that he dared to look into the still waters of a pond and found there his own image, so captivating that he could not look away. Day after day, he knelt by the water's edge, staring, admiring, worshipping the reflection as though it were a god, until at last he fell in and drowned, his body consumed by the very waters that had offered him the image he so adored. The moral, the priest insisted, was clear. To seek one's reflection, to indulge in the temptation of self-contemplation, was to court death and damnation. For what was vanity but the elevation of the self above all else, above neighbor, above duty, above God? And what was a reflection but the perfect tool of Satan himself, a seductive, silent invitation to turn inward rather than outward, to forsake humility for pride, service for self-obsession? As he spoke, you felt the familiar, creeping unease that always accompanied these sermons, but this time it was sharper, more pointed, as though the words were aimed directly at you, at the memory of your own hesitant glances into the stream, at the image of the weaver's daughter smiling faintly at her reflection before she disappeared. You shifted on the bench, your hands curling into fists against your thighs, your gaze dropping to the packed dirt floor, as if doing so might shield you from the accusation implicit in the priest's voice. He continued, describing how the devil exploited such moments of vanity, slipping through the surface of the mirror like a serpent through grass, coiling his dark influence around the soul of the unsuspecting sinner until all that remained was a hollow shell, a body animated not by divine grace, but by infernal deception. He spoke of women who spent too long gazing into polished metal, who found themselves unable to recognize the line between their own desires and the devil's whispers, of men who preened before battle, polishing their armor not for protection, but for admiration, and who fell on the field not from the strength of their enemies, but from the weakness of their own pride. You thought again of the Lord's gleaming breastplate, of the distorted image of yourself captured fleetingly in its merciless curve, and you wondered whether he, too, was guilty of vanity, whether he, too, was condemned for the sin of admiring his own reflection. But the priest's words made it clear that the rules did not apply equally to all. The nobility, by virtue of their station, were permitted, even expected, to cultivate their image, for theirs was a reflection sanctioned by God, a reflection that affirmed the divine order of the world. It was only people like you who must beware, who must avert their eyes from the deceptive surfaces of water and metal lest they fall prey to the seductive promise of seeing themselves too clearly. The sermon ended as it always did, with a call to repentance and a warning of the fires that awaited those who strayed too far from the path of humility. The congregation filed out slowly, heads bowed, the murmur of rote prayers blending with the creak of the old wooden door and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by the afternoon wind. You lingered, as you often did, letting the others pass, so that you could exit in silence, unnoticed, your mind still tangled in the priest's words. That afternoon, as you walked the stream to collect water, you found yourself hesitating at the bank, staring down at the murky surface that only days before it seemed so innocuous, so familiar. Now it felt dangerous, almost sentient, as though it were waiting for you to lean in too close, to seek something in its depths that you had no right to seek. You knelt cautiously, filling your bucket without looking directly at the water, keeping your gaze fixed on the task at hand, on the steady, mindless rhythm of dipping and lifting. But despite your efforts, your eyes were inevitably drawn to the surface, to the faint, ghostly impression of your own face refracted to the silt and the shifting light. You stared at it for a long, tense moment, searching for any sign of the demonic influence the priest had warned of, any flicker of movement or distortion that might suggest the presence of something other than your own weary features. But there was nothing, only the same hollow eyes, the same thin mouth, the same unkempt hair that you had known all your life, rendered now not as a neutral fact, but as a potential site of spiritual peril. You thought then of the children in the village, of how they splashed and played in the river without care, their reflections breaking apart and reforming with every movement, their laughter filling the air with a sound so pure and irreverent that it seemed almost sacrilegious. Were they, too, guilty of vanity, of the sin of engaging with their own images? Or did the innocence of youth exempt them, rendering their reflections harmless, their interactions with the water playful rather than perilous? You could not answer these questions, could not untangle the web of prohibitions and permissions that the priest had woven so deftly around the simple, natural act of seeing oneself. All you knew was that the act of reflection had been irrevocably altered, transformed from a mundane, even necessary aspect of daily life into a moral and spiritual hazard, a trap laid by forces beyond your comprehension. In the days that followed, you found yourself avoiding the stream more than usual, opting instead to draw water from the well whenever possible, though the effort required was greater and the water itself often tasted stale and metallic. When you did approach the river, you did so with deliberate caution, keeping your head bowed, your eyes fixed on the ground, as though the very act of looking might summon the devil from the depths. But avoidance did not bring peace, only a different kind of anxiety, a heightened awareness of the ever-present possibility of sin lurking in the most ordinary of actions. You began to see reflections everywhere, even where none should exist. In the slick surface of a rain-soaked stone, in the faint sheen of oil on the surface of your stew, in the gleam of your own sweat as it pooled on your forearms during long days of labor. Each time, your heart clenched with the fear that you had stumbled unwittingly into yet another opportunity for vanity, another chance for the devil to insinuate himself into your soul through the thin, fragile membrane of your own image. And yet, for all your vigilance, you could not wholly suppress the impulse to look, to seek out your reflection despite, or perhaps because of the warnings that now framed it as dangerous and forbidden. There were moments, late at night when the village was silent, and the only light came from the dying embers of the fire, when you found yourself staring into the dark, reflective surface of the cooking pot, your face barely visible in its soot-blackened curve, and feeling a strange, aching pull toward the very thing you had been told to avoid. It was not vanity, not as the priest described it, not the self-satisfied preening of a man enamored with his own beauty, but something deeper, more primal. The need to know that you existed, to confirm that your face, your body, your life were real, and not merely the disembodied figments of some cruel and arbitrary divinity. In those moments, you understood that the sin was not in the looking itself, but in the meaning that others ascribed to it, in the fear and suspicion that turn a simple human impulse into a mark of damnation. And so you lived, caught between the admonitions of the church and the inexorable pull of your own reflection, navigating a world where every glance, every glimmer, every mirrored surface carried with it the potential for spiritual ruin. You learned to move carefully, to temper your gaze, to seek out only those reflections that could not be avoided, and to turn away from those that could, all the while carry within you the quiet, unspoken knowledge that the true sin was not in seeing yourself, but in being made to fear what you saw. The river does not discriminate. It carries everything. Your fears, your waste, your ancestors' bones long since ground to silt and scattered to tides, your brother's favorite wooden toy that slipped from his fingers when he was too young to know the finality of loss, and today, of course, the body. It floats not with the grace of stories you've heard of noble warriors laid to rest in Viking ships, their corpses set aflame and pushed toward the horizon in a blaze of honor, but instead with the dull inevitability of meat gone bad, swollen and pale beneath the battered remnants of a woolen tunic now so sodden that it clings to flesh like a second, loathsome skin. You don't know the name of the dead man, or at least you tell yourself that you don't, though there's a gnawing familiarity to the way the arm is bent at that unnatural angle, to the splay of fingers still curled around nothing, to the faint, dark halo where the skull must have cracked against some hidden rock upstream. You stand at the bank, your bucket still empty in your hand, your toes curling instinctively into the cold mud, as though grounding yourself in this moment will make it any less real. The water moves indifferently around the body, as it always moves, as it will continue to move long after this corpse has caught on some snagging branch or submerged root and been pecked apart by fish and insects until nothing of it remains but bone and then less than bone. You know this because you've seen it before, not once, but many times, for the river is a constant devourer in your life, as reliable in its consumption as the passing of the seasons or the creeping ache in your joints after a long day's labor. And yet, today it feels different, not because of the body itself, though there is, as always, a queasy sense of violation at the sight of death made so utterly mundane, but because of what the water shows you just beyond it, your own reflection, hovering alongside the dead man's face, the two of you suspended together in the same surface, separated only by the faint, trembling distortion of the current. You stare at this terrible pairing, at the juxtaposition of your living face, drawn and anxious, and his slack and waxen, and for the first time in your life the river seems not like a place of utility or punishment, but like a mirror in which all possibilities converge. You try to pull your eyes away, to refocus on the simple task that brought you here, the collection of water for the day's chores, but your body resists. Some inner part of you transfixed by the tableau the river has laid out, the dead and the living, the past and the present, the inevitable and the temporarily spared, all compressed into a single, trembling image. You can see yourself so clearly now, far more clearly than the usual scattered glimpses offered by a puddle or the dull curve of a metal pot. The water here is deeper, the current slower, and the light of the overcast sky strikes it at just the right angle to smooth the surface into something perilously close to glass. For a moment, you think of the Venetian mirrors you've heard about in whispered stories, of surfaces so pure and so cruel that they reveal everything, that they offer no quarter to vanity or self-deception, and you realize with a sick jolt that this river is your Venetian mirror, that this moment, this grotesque, accidental encounter, is the most honest reflection you have ever received. Not just of your face, though that alone is shocking enough. The furrows carved into your brow, the faint smudge of grime along your cheekbone, the cracked skin at the corners of your mouth from too many winters spent breathing air so cold it burned. But more than that, a reflection of your condition, your place in the unrelenting machinery of life and death that the river embodies so perfectly. The body drifts a little closer, nudged by some invisible hand, and the image fractures, the water rippling first around his shoulder, then around your own reflection, the two faces blurring together until, for a split second, you cannot tell which is yours and which is his. The panic that flares in your chest that this is sharp and bright, a sudden, electric reminder of your own mortality, of the thin and fragile boundary that separates your breathing body from this inert, waterlogged husk. You step back instinctively, your heels sinking into the cold muck of the riverbank, your grip tightening reflexively around the wooden handle of your bucket, as though it might anchor you to the world of the living. But even as you retreat, your eyes remain locked on the water, unable to relinquish this awful communion. You think then of the priest's warnings about vanity, about the sin of seeking one's reflection, about the dangers of mirrors and the seductions of self-recognition. But this is not vanity. This is something more primitive, more elemental. The need to confirm beyond all doubt that you are still here, still animate, still on this side of the veil. And yet, even as you stand breathing and upright on the bank, There is an undeniable sense that some part of you has already been absorbed into the river, that some aspect of your being is now inseparably entangled with the image of the dead man drifting just beneath the surface. You wonder who he was, what small life he carried before the river claimed him. Did he, too, come here each day to collect water, to fish, to wash the dirt and sweat from his skin? Did he, too, once stare into these same dark depths and see his own reflection, not knowing that one day he would become part of the very scenery he once took for granted? And more chilling still, is there someone, somewhere upstream, standing on another bank right now, looking at your reflection hovering near the corpse of yet another poor soul and feeling the same cold dread? The thought makes you shiver, and you finally tear your gaze away. Turn your eyes toward the familiar landmarks of the riverbank, the twisted roots that grasp at the soil like arthritic fingers, the tangle of reeds where frogs and snakes hide from the hawks that circle above, the battered stones that form the crude steps leading down to the water's edge. These things are solid, immutable, indifferent to your terror or your awe, and their presence offers a small, bitter comfort. You kneel carefully, angling your body so that the reflection no longer aligns with the corpse, so that the water shows you only the dull, abstract patterns of current and shadow, and you dip your bucket in, filling it as quickly as you can before the trembling of your hands becomes too obvious. As you lift the bucket out, the water spills over the rim in an ungainly arc, splashing onto your feet, seeping into the worn leather of your boots, but you hardly notice, your mind still entangled with the image you have just witnessed. On the walk back to the village, the bucket's weight is a reassuring presence at your side, its rhythmic sway as you walk grounding you in the physical world, but your thoughts remain with the river, with the terrible reflection it offered you, with a body that by now is surely drifting further downstream, carried along by the same indifferent current that will, in time, carry all things, yourself included. You pass other villagers along the path, nodding in a perfunctory way that is customary, answering their half-hearted inquiries about the weather or the state of the fields with monosyllables, all the while shielding the raw, private memory of the river encounter from their casual, oblivious chatter. That night, as you sit by the fire, your clothes steaming faintly as they dry, you find yourself staring once again into the reflective surface of the cooking pot, its soot-darkened metal offering only the faintest hint of your features. But it is enough to conjure the image of the river once more, of the dead man's face merging with your own, of the water becoming not just a medium of reflection, but a conduit of fate. You reach out, almost without thinking, to touch the pot's surface, your fingers tracing the faint outline of your cheek, your nose, your lips, as though mapping the features that, one day, will inevitably be reduced to something as anonymous and inert as the body you saw that morning. You sit like that for a long time, the fire's warmth barely registering against the cold that has settled deep within you, a cold not of the body but of the soul, a cold born of the sudden, irrevocable awareness that reflection is not merely an act of seeing, but a confrontation with the inescapable truth of your own mortality. And as the embers crumble to ash and the night closes in around your hovel, you realize that you will never again look at the river, or at your own reflection within it, the same way. From now on, every glance will carry with it the ghost of the dead man, the silent, accusatory reminder that one day it will be your face floating there, your body becoming just another indistinct shape in the water, your reflection merging finally and forever with the river's endless, indifferent flow. You do not know much about alchemists beyond what you have heard in the muttered warnings of elders and the sensational tales spun by the few travelers brave or foolish enough to pass through your village with their packs full of trinkets and their mouths full of lies. They are, you have been told, men who seek to defy the natural order, who meddle with elements that God himself set apart for reasons beyond mortal comprehension, who traffic in the dangerous ambition of transforming base metals into gold, and, worse yet, of transforming men into something they were never meant to be. But what you do know or think you know is that somewhere far from here, beyond the dark forest and the crooked roads that stretch endlessly into the unknown, there are men who have learned to make true mirrors, not from the smudged, warped metal plates of the nobles, nor from the treacherous stillness of water, but from glass, thin as a blade, backed with a poisonous sheen of metal, so that it captures an image with an accuracy so sharp it could cut. It is said, and here the voices always drop to a near whisper, as if the mere invocation of the knowledge might call forth its consequences, that these men, these alchemists, trade their health, their vision, even their sanity for the ability to create such mirrors. You think of them sometimes when you are alone, usually at the riverbank when the day's work is done, and there is a rare moment of stillness when the fading light turns the water's surface into a bruised sheet of shadow, and you catch the faintest echo of your own face trembling on its skin. You imagine them bent over their furnaces, their skin slick with sweat, their lungs choked with the acrid fumes of substances you cannot even name, grinding minerals into fine powders, mixing them with mercury and lead, the vapors creeping into their blood, fogging their eyes until they are blind, their hands shaking so badly they can no longer hold the tools of their trade. But even as their bodies decay, their mirrors remain, cold and perfect, unclouded by time or illness, bearing silent witness to a world that no longer acknowledges the men who made them. And you wonder, with a mixture of fear and fascination, what it would be like to look into such a mirror, to see yourself rendered with such unforgiving precision that no flaw could be denied, no comforting distortion could soften the truth of what you are. Would it be a revelation or a curse? Would you emerge in the encounter with a clearer sense of yourself? Or would you find that there is no self at all, only the accumulation of scars and habits, of compromises and disappointments, laid bare beneath the relentless clarity of the glass? The villagers speak of these mirrors as though they are instruments of pure evil, portals through which demons might reach into the world. But you suspect that their true horror lies not in what they let in, but in what they show, in the inescapable reflection of all that one would rather leave unseen. And so you cannot help but be drawn to the story of these alchemists, even as you recoil from the consequences of their work, for in their pursuit you recognize a distorted version of your own impulses, the desire to see, to know, to understand, even at the cost of comfort, even at the risk of destruction. It is said that some of these alchemists go mad before they ever complete their mirrors, their minds unraveling under the strain of the knowledge they seek, their dreams invaded by images they cannot explain, by visions of faces reflected endlessly in glass, each one slightly different from the last, until they can no longer remember which is the real one and which is the echo. Others persist long enough to finish their creations, only to find that the very act of crafting a true mirror has rendered them incapable of looking into it. There is a story, one you heard from a traveling friar many years ago, of an alchemist who, after spending decades perfecting his mirror, finally stood before it, naked and unarmed, and upon seeing his reflection so unflinchingly clear, so brutally exact, fell to his knees and wept until his eyes dried up and he died there, his body slumped against the glass that had both completed and destroyed him. You cannot say whether you believe these stories, or whether they are merely cautionary tales told to keep curious minds like yours in check, to remind you that some knowledge is better left unpursued. But still, the image lingers, haunting your thoughts as you go about your days, as you chop wood and tend the animals and scrub the dirt from your clothes in the icy water of the stream. It is there when you catch sight of your own reflection in the water's uncertain surface, when you lean over to rinse your hands and see, for just an instant, the tired curve of your jaw, the hollow of your cheeks, the dull gleam of your eyes. You wonder what an alchemist's mirror would make of you, whether it would confer what you already suspect, that you are little more than a collection of accumulated failures and necessary compromises, a body worn down by years of labor and deprivation, or whether it might reveal something else entirely, some hidden core of strength or beauty that has thus far eluded your notice. But you know, too, that such a mirror would not care about your hopes or your fears, that would offer only what is indifferent to what you wish might be. There are moments when you think of seeking out such a mirror, of leaving behind the narrow confines of the village, and venturing into the wider world, of finding one of these alchemists before they succumb to blindness or madness, and asking to see what they have made. But the thought is fleeting, immediately overtaken by the practical realities of your life. The need to plant the spring crops, to repair the fence where the sheep broke through last week, to gather enough firewood to last through the next storm. These tasks, mundane as they are, form the boundaries of your existence, and though you chafe against them, you also recognize them as the only thing keeping you tethered to the world, to the rhythms of life that, for all their harshness, are at least familiar. And yet, even within these boundaries, the idea of the alchemist's mirror exerts its quiet, insistent pull. You find yourself paying more attention to the surfaces around you, to the ways in which different materials catch and hold the light. The faint gleam of the cooking pot as you scrub it clean, the shimmer of dew on the grass at dawn, the oily slick that sometimes forms on the surface of the water after a rain. Each one offers its own version of reflection, its own approximation of what a true mirror might be, and you study them with a new intensity, searching for hints of what might be possible, for some sign that the world contains more than rough, distorted images you have known all your life. You begin to experiment in small, secretive ways. One evening, after the others have gone to bed, you take a piece of metal scrap from the blacksmith's refuse pile and spend hours polishing it with a handful of coarse sand and a scrap of wool until it is smooth enough to catch the faintest suggestion of your face. It is still far from perfect, the surface pitted and uneven, but it reflects more than any other object you possess, and you find yourself staring into it long after the fire has died down, tracing the ghosts of your features with a mixture of pride and dread. In these private moments, you feel a kinship with the alchemists you have never met, with the men whose pursuit of the perfect mirror led them to blindness, madness, or death. You understand, as perhaps only someone who has lived their whole life without the luxury of a true reflection can understand, the allure of that quest, the intoxicating promise of seeing oneself fully and without distortion, no matter the cost. And you wonder, too, whether the very absence of such a reflection in your life has spared you from their fate, whether the imperfections and limitations of the reflections you do encounter serve not only to frustrate, but also protect you from the unbearable clarity that a true mirror would impose. As the seasons turn and the days grow shorter, you find that your thoughts return increasingly to the image of the alchemist hunched over his furnace, his eyes red and weeping from the fumes, his hands trembling as he sets the final layer of metal onto the glass. You imagine him lifting the finished mirror, holding it up to the light, and then, perhaps hesitating, his own reflection staring back at him for the first time with a precision he cannot bear. You think of him lowering the mirror, turning it to face the wall, perhaps even shattering it to spare himself the agony of seeing what he has become. And you realize with a sudden, painful clarity that this is the ultimate truth of the alchemist's mirror, the lesson buried beneath all the warnings and superstitions. That the danger lies not in the mirror itself, nor in the act of looking, but in the refusal to accept what the mirror shows. It is not the glass or the metal that destroys the alchemist, but his own inability to reconcile the image before him with the image he holds in his mind, his own unwillingness to embrace the unvarnished reality of his existence. You sit with this realization for a long time, letting it settle into your bones alongside all the other truths you have accumulated over the years. The certainty of labor, the inevitability of loss, the slow, relentless erosion of the body by time and toil. And you understand, finally, that while you may never see yourself reflected in a true mirror, while you may never know the exact contours of your face rendered in perfect, merciless detail, you already possess what the alchemist sought and what, in the end, destroyed them: the capacity to see yourself, however imperfectly, and to live with what you see. The painter arrived not with fanfare, but with the quiet inevitability of someone accustomed to entering and exiting lives like a shadow, leaving behind only traces that might outlast him, but which he himself would soon forget. You heard about his presence in the village before you saw him. The whispers floating between the huts and around the hearths, a mixture of fascination and suspicion that clung to all outsiders, but especially to those whose trade seemed to exist beyond the necessary cycles of sowing and harvesting, birth and death, labor and rest. A man who made pictures was no more immediately useful than a poet or musician, his skills neither filling bellies nor patching roofs. And yet there was something about the idea of him that stirred the curiosity of people who, like you, had spent their entire lives surrounded by the same few faces, the same few forms. When you finally saw him, seated on a low stool in the market square, brush poised above a flat wooden panel propped against his knee, your first thought was how ordinary he looked. Not all the conjure of images you had imagined, but rather a man shaped by the same sun and wind and hunger that shaped you, his skin weathered, his clothes simple and travel-worn. And yet, there was something in the way he held himself, in the deliberate stillness with which he regarded his subject, a broad-shouldered butcher's son with a face like a carved turnip, that set him apart, a quiet assurance that his gaze could fix a person in place, capture their essence with a flick of a brushstroke, and render them permanent in a way that life, with its relentless cycles of decay, never could. You did not intend to sit for him. The very idea seemed absurd, indulgent in a way that bordered on sinful, to willingly submit to being transformed into an image, to become something looked at rather than something that simply endured. You had spent your whole life on the periphery of visibility, your reflection glimpsed only in passing, in distorted surfaces that you neither trusted nor invited, to be seen so deliberately, so intentionally, to be preserved in pigment and oil, seemed as unnatural as it was irresistible. It was the painter himself who approached you after several days of observing you from a distance, or so he claimed, as you went about your work in the fields and at the riverbank. He said he had noticed something in your posture, in the way you carried the bucket slung low against your hip, in the set of your shoulders as you hauled wood or knelt to weed the garden. He spoke in a voice that was soft but insistent, a voice used to coaxing reluctant subjects into stillness, into submission. You resisted at first, mumbling some excuse about your obligations, about how there was too much to be done before the harvest, but he only smiled in that knowing, infuriating way that people do when they sense that your objections are not genuine, but rather the brutal defenses of someone who fears being seen too clearly. And so you sat perched on a rough-hewn bench outside the blacksmith shop, your hands resting awkwardly in your lap, your eyes fixed on some indeterminate point in the distance as the painter worked in silence, his brush moving in quick, assured strokes across the surface of the panel. You tried not to think about what he was seeing, about what part of you he was choosing to emphasize, to immortalize. You had no say in the matter, no ability to protest if he decided to soften the angle of your jaw or sharpen the furrows in your brow. If he painted you as more noble than you felt or more brutish than you feared. The villagers gathered to watch, of course, their curiosity outweighing their disdain for what many of them muttered was a frivolous, almost blasphemous undertaking. They speculated openly about how the finished image would look, whether it would capture the hollowness beneath your cheekbones or the particular slant of your nose, whether it would make you seem younger or older, kinder or harsher. You heard their comments but did not respond, keeping your body as still as you could, your expression neutral, though inside you churned with a complex blend of anxiety and anticipation. When the painter finally declared himself finished, he stood back with a satisfied sigh and tilted the panel so that you and everyone else could see what he had made. The villagers gasped in unison, some murmuring in admiration, others snickering with the uneasy laughter that comes when confronted with something both familiar and alien. You looked at the image and felt a strange association, as though the figure rendered in those muted earth tones, with its weary eyes and set jaw, was both you and not you, a version of yourself distilled to the painter's sensibility, filtered through his brush, through his choices. It was not the reflection you were used to, not the shifting, unreliable image offered by the river or the faint smudge glimpsed in a pot of water, but something fixed, immutable, a representation of you that would endure even as your own body continued to erode under the weight of time and labor. And yet, for all its permanence, it felt oddly false, or perhaps incomplete, as though in capturing your form the painter had inevitably missed something essential about your life, your experience, the layers of weariness and quiet resilience that no brush, no matter how skilled, could fully convey. You stood and thanked him with the stiff formality expected in such moments, even as your mind reeled with the implications of what had just occurred. The painter accepted your thanks with the same easy detachment he had maintained throughout the sitting, then wrapped the panel carefully in a cloth and packed it away with the others he had completed during his brief stay in the village. You watched as he loaded his belongings onto a cart the next morning, as he exchanged a few final pleasantries with the villagers and then disappeared down the rutted road, leaving behind only the memory of his presence and the peculiar, unsettling relic of your own image. In the days that followed, you thought often the portrait, of where it might go next, who might one day look upon it and form an opinion about you based solely on the arrangement of pigments on a wooden board. The idea that you could exist in such a way, as an object to be viewed, analyzed, perhaps even admired, without any say in the matter, filled you with a mixture of pride and unease. You had always understood yourself in terms of what you did, of the labor you performed, of the tasks that defined your place within the community, to be represented visually, abstracted from those actions, reduced to a mere image, was to be transformed into something you did not entirely recognize. You began to notice, too, how the other villagers looked at you differently in the wake of the painting, how their eyes lingered a bit longer, their expressions tinged with a mixture of curiosity and amusement, as though you had been marked by the experience, set apart from them in some ineffable way. Some treated it as a joke, teasing you about your newfound status as an artwork, while others seemed vaguely resentful, as if by sitting for the painter you had somehow presumed to elevate yourself above your station. But beneath all of these surface reactions, you sense something deeper, something unspoken but palpably present. A collective awareness of the power inherent in being seen, in being rendered permanent, however imperfectly, in a world where most lives passed unnoticed, unrecorded, slipping silently into the earth with nothing to mark their passage save the fading memories of those who had known them. You had been made visible in a way that most of the villagers never would be, and while that visibility carried with it a certain vulnerability, it also conferred a kind of significance, however illusory. And so, even as the painting itself disappeared from your life, carried off to some distant market or private collection where it will be viewed by strangers who would never know your name or your story, its existence continued to shape your understanding of yourself, to inform the way you navigated the small, circumscribed world of the village. You found yourself moving differently, more aware of the way your body occupied space, of how you might appear others, of the fact that, for at least one moment in your life, you have been deemed worthy of representation. You continued, of course, to perform the same tasks, to rise before dawn and labor until dusk, to tend animals and mend the tools and gather water from the stream. But these actions now carried an additional, subtle layer of meaning, as though you were performing them not just for their immediate utility, but also as part of broader, ongoing negotiation with the image that the painter had created, with a version of yourself that now existed independently of your control. And in quiet moments, when you found yourself alone at the riverbank or resting in the shade of a tree at the edge of the field, you would sometimes close your eyes and try to recall the details of the painting. The angle of your jaw, the set of your mouth, the particular way the light had caught in your eyes. You would try to reconcile that fixed image with the fluid, ever-changing reflection you saw in the water, with the rough, unvarnished reality of your daily existence. And you would wonder, as perhaps all who are made into images must wonder, which version was more real, which one would endure, and which one, ultimately, defined you. The merchant arrived in the village with the unsettling aura of someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere all at once. His wares packed tightly onto a mule that looked almost as exhausted and mistrustful as a man himself. You watched him from a distance at first, as did everyone else, knowing the peculiar mixture of defiance and weariness in the way he held himself, the way he tied his pack so meticulously even though it sagged under the weight of countless objects whose uses you could not begin to guess. The village was always suspicious of outsiders, especially those who carried goods instead of tools, who traded in rarities instead of necessities, whose value was measured not in what they produced with their hands, but in what they ferried from one place to another as though possession itself were a kind of power. But what drew your attention, what rooted you in place with a kind of breathless, involuntary fascination, was not the man but the thing he carried, a shard of polished obsidian, nestled carefully among bolts of dyed cloth and small pouches of spices and dried roots, its surface so smooth and black that it absorbed the light around it, rendering itself almost invisible unless viewed from just the right angle. You had heard of such object before, though always as rumor, as superstition, as part of the traveling tales told by men who claimed to have ventured into lands where the very stones bled shadow, and the earth itself yielded up materials not of this world. To see one here in your village in the faint, dusty light of the market square was to feel as though the boundary between the mundane and the magical had suddenly, inexplicably, grown thin enough to breach. The merchant noticed your gaze, of course. Such men always do. He said nothing at first, merely lifting the shard delicately from its resting place and holding out toward you with the practiced ease of someone who understands that silence can be more persuasive than any sales pitch. You took an involuntary step closer, your breath catching your throat as you regarded the object more fully, seeing now that its surface was not merely dark, but deep, a kind of fathomless, liquid blackness that seemed to bend the very air around it. He invited you to touch it with a slight incline of his head, and though every part you screamed to retreat, to turn away from this unnatural thing, your hand lifted of its own accord, your fingers brushing against the impossibly smooth plane with shiver that ran not across your skin, but straight through the core of you. It was colder than you expected, colder even than the river in the early spring thaw, and as you looked down into its depths, you saw not your reflection exactly, but something else, something adjacent to you, something that mimicked your form but with a subtle, disorienting difference that you could not quite name. It was as though the shard showed not just your face, but the possibility of your face, the echo of it refracted through some dark and ancient logic you could not hope to understand. For a brief, dizzying moment, it felt as though the obsidian held not merely your image, but some essential part of you, as though it were capable of extracting your reflection from your body and keeping it trapped within its lightless confines, preserved indefinitely as a ghost of yourself. The merchant must have seen the change in your expression, the way your eyes widened and your breath stilled. For he smiled then, not kindly but knowingly, as a man might smile at a bird caught in a snare of its own making. He said something about how the shard had come from a volcano far to the south, from a place where the earth split open and disgorged its molten heart, and how men there shaped these black stones into mirrors and blades, into objects of power and fear. He spoke of their use in rituals, in divinations, in acts of both healing and harm, and though the words were strange and filled with references to gods and customs you had never heard of, you understood instinctively that he was not lying, that this was no ordinary object, but something with a history, with a purpose, with an intent. You asked him, your voice barely more than a whisper, what it was meant to do, and he shrugged in that infuriatingly indifferent way that merchants always do when they know the value of their wares lies not in their function, but in their mystery. He told you only that it was a mirror of sorts, and that it showed what most mirrors could not, what lay beneath the surface, what lingered in the spaces between the visible and the hidden. Then, almost as an afterthought, he named his price, a sum so absurdly beyond your means that you could only laugh, a hollow, helpless sound that was as much relief as regret. But even after he packed the shard away and moved on to the next curious villager, offering them lengths of cloth or small, fragrant bundles of dried herbs, you remained rooted in place, your mind still trapped in the moment when your reflection had hovered within that black glass like something alive, something waiting. The rest of the day passed in a kind of dull haze. You performed your usual tasks, carried your usual burdens, but all the while, the memory of the shard clung to you, wrapping itself around your thoughts with the tenacity of ivy strangling the stone walls of the church. That night, long after the village had gone to sleep, you found yourself back in the market square, standing before the now empty space where the merchant's stall had been, staring down at the faint impressions his feet had left in the dirt, as though they might offer some clue, some residual fragment of the encounter that could help you make sense of what you had seen. But there was nothing, only the cold wind sighing to the bare branches above, only the darkness pressing in at the edges of your vision, and only the reflection of yourself that now haunted every surface, every patch of water, every scrap of metal, every moment when your gaze slipped from the task at hand and caught, however briefly, on the image of your own face staring back at you. The shard had awakened something in you, had reminded you, in a way more visceral than any sermon or cautionary tale ever could, that reflection was not merely about recognition, but about confrontation, about facing not just who you are, but who you might be, who you fear becoming, who you might already become without realizing it. In the days that followed, you found yourself avoiding your own reflection even more than usual, turning your head sharply away from the stream as you filled your buckets, averting your eyes from the glint of polished tools, even washing your hands in the dark so that the faint sheen of water could not betray you. But avoidance, you quickly discovered, was a futile strategy. The shard had shown you that reflection was not a thing you could escape by simply refusing to look, that it was woven into the very fabric of existence, lurking always at the periphery of perception, ready to assert itself at the most inopportune moments. And so you began gradually to confront it, to allow your gaze to linger a little longer in those places where your image surfaced, to study the contours of your face, the lines etched deeper by each passing year, the subtle shifts in expression that spoke of thoughts and desires you did not fully understand. You realized, too, that the shard had altered not just how you saw yourself, but how you saw others, that you had begun to notice the ways in which everyone around you engaged or refused to engage with their own reflections, how some avoided the river entirely, while others seemed to seek out its surface compulsively, as though driven by the same restless, inarticulate hunger that now pulsed quietly within you. You watched them with a new, unsettling clarity, recognizing in their gestures and glances the same mix of fear and fascination that the shard had ignited in you, the same uneasy awareness that to look at oneself is always to risk seeing too much, or worse, seeing nothing at all. And so the shard remained with you, not as a physical object. You could never have afforded it, even if you had dared to buy it, but as an idea, as an experience, as a reminder that reflection is never passive, never benign, but always an encounter fraught with the potential for revelation and ruin. It reshaped your understanding of mirrors, of surfaces, of the very act of seeing, teaching you that what you perceive in those moments of confrontation is never simply an image, but a story, a history, a possibility. And that sometimes the most terrifying thing about reflection is not what it shows you, but what it suggests you might become in time. The merchant's visit faded from the collective memory of the village, replaced by the usual rhythms of planting and harvesting, of births and deaths, of celebrations and calamities. But for you, the shard remained indelibly etched into your consciousness, a dark, gleaming fragment of something larger and more incomprehensible, something that opened a door you could never again fully close. And though you continue to live as you always had, to perform the same tasks and follow the same routines, you did so now with the quiet, persistent knowledge that every surface capable of reflecting your image was also capable of reflecting your fears, your desires, your truths, and that whether you chose to look or not, those reflections would remain silent and patient, waiting always for the moment when you could no longer turn away. The children whisper about the reflection thief long before you ever heard the story in full, their voices lilting and conspiratorial, carrying the same blend of mischief and dread that all their games seemed to possess, as though they knew instinctively that terror and play were simply different shades of the same instinct. You would catch fragments of it as you passed the alleys and clearings where they gathered, their small hands clutching makeshift talismans carved from bone and wood, their eyes darting nervously toward the river or the dark corners beneath the eaves where shadows clustered thickest. They spoke of a figure who came at night when the village was silent and still, slipping through cracks in doors and beneath shutters, searching not for coin or food, but for something far more intimate and irreplaceable, the reflection of the sleeping. At first, you dismissed it as nothing more than the usual fabrications children wove to make sense of the world, to fill the gaps left by adult explanations that were too blunt or too evasive to satisfy their need for stories. But then you began to notice the other signs. The small offerings left by doorways in the dead of night, scraps of cloth or bread placed with careful reverence as though in an attempt to appease or distract something whose hunger could not be fully comprehended. The older women in the village said little, but their silence was heavy with the kind of consent that turned superstition into law, and soon enough you found yourself taking a long way around certain places at dusk, avoiding pools of standing water, where your reflection might linger too long, where it might be left vulnerable to the invisible hands of the thief who, according to the whispers, did not just steal your image, but something essential, something that once taken could never be restored. You first heard the story in its entirety from a boy no older than 8, his knees scabbed and his face streaked with the residue of a summer spent in the fields and woods. He told it with the earnest authority that only children possess, his voice low but urgent as he recounted how the reflection thief would slip into a house and stand silently at the foot of the bed, waiting for the exact moment when the sleeper exhaled just so, when their bodies slackened into the deepest, most defenseless state of rest. Then, and only then, the thief would reach out, not with hands but with something colder, thinner, more precise, and lift the sleeper's reflection out from them as easily as plucking a hair from a coat. The body would remain, of course, continuing to breathe and stir and wake as usual, but from that night onward, something would be different, something would be missing, and those who had been taken in this way would slowly begin to fade. The boy spoke of men who grew pale and distant, who no longer responded to their names or recognized their kin, of women who lost their voices, who could no longer catch their own eye in the mirror without shuddering, of children who simply wandered off one day, their bodies moving aimlessly until they disappeared into the forest or the marsh, never to be seen again. The only sign that the reflection thief had visited, he said, was the faintest smudge on a window pane, a misty imprint like the condensation left by breath on a cold morning, and sometimes, not always, but often enough to be remembered, a single strand of hair found coiled neatly on the floor beside the bed. You wanted to laugh, to brush it off as a kind of tale that flourishes in places where fear is more abundant than comfort. But the boy's eyes were wide and solemn, his small fingers knotted together with the tension of someone who had seen something he could not quite name. And so you merely nodded and moved on, carrying the story with you as you carried all things in this life, with quiet resignation. That night, you found yourself staring at your reflection in the water bucket long after the others had gone to sleep, watching the way the flickering candlelight made your features twist and blur in the shallow pool. You imagine what it would feel like for that image to be stolen, to wake up and find yourself somehow diminished, unable to articulate what had been lost, but knowing with a certainty beyond reason that it was gone. You thought of the times you had looked into your own eyes and not recognized or stare back, of the moments when your reflection had seemed to regard you with an independence that was almost contemptuous, as though it had long since outgrown your need for it. In the days that followed, the story of the reflection thief began to permeate your thoughts more insistently, shaping the way you moved through the village, the way you approached your chores, even the way you slept. You began to position your bed away from the narrow window, drawing the curtain tightly each night, as though that thin scrap of fabric could offer protection against a force that had no use for doors or walls. You avoided standing too long in front of the river, afraid that the prolonged exposure your image might make it more vulnerable, might mark you as an easier target for the thief's peculiar appetite. But avoidance, as you already knew from so many other parts of your life, is not the same as escape. The story lodged itself deeper within you, threading through your dreams until you found yourself waking in the small hours of the night with a distinct and disorienting sensation that something was missing, that some small, critical piece of yourself had been quietly removed while you slept. You would lie there in the dark, your breath shallow, listening to the familiar sounds of the village, dogs barking distantly, the creak of timber in the wind, and you would wonder whether you had already been taken, whether the process of fading was already underway, imperceptible but inevitable. You noticed, too, that others in the village moved differently now, that the story of the reflection thief, whether spoken aloud or merely understood in the grim set of mouths and the wary dart of eyes, had begun to alter the communal rhythm in subtle but unmistakable ways. People averted their gazes from still water more often, turned away from the glassy surfaces of pots and tools, as if their reflections there might betray them. The laughter of the children who had first carried the story now held an edge of nervousness, a brittle quality that suggested even they were no longer certain whether they believed in the game they had created or feared the truth of it more than they could admit. One morning, you found an old woman standing by the well, her hands trembling as she poured a ladle of water over her face, then quickly wiped it dry with the hem of her apron, muttering under her breath in a language or dialect you could not quite place. She caught your eye and for a moment seemed about to speak, but then she turned sharply and hurried away, leaving you alone with the echo of her muttered words and the faint, damp imprint of her reflection fading from the surface of the well. You began to think of reflections not as simple accidents of light and surface, but as entities in their own right, as extensions or perhaps even independent manifestations of those who cast them. The idea that something could sever you from your reflection, could steal it and leave you outwardly unchanged but inwardly hollowed out, no longer seemed absurd but instead began to feel like the only explanation for pervasive, ineffable sense of absence that had taken root within you. You thought of the man who had been found wandering the edge of the forest last autumn, his clothes ragged, his eyes blank and unfocused, his mouth moving silently as if trying to recall a language he no longer remembered. At the time, the villagers had assumed he was simply mad, driven to incoherence by hunger or grief, but now you wondered whether he had been taken, whether the reflection thief had found him sleeping one night and left him as little more than a moving shell. As the weeks passed and the days shortened, the story of the reflection thief settled into the marrow of village life, not as an overt superstition, but as a quiet, omnipresent understanding, a shared dread that required no retelling to sustain its hold. And though the merchant moved on, and the children invented new games, and the priest delivered sermons about sins of a more conventional nature, you knew that the story would remain, would linger like the faint mist of a breath on a cold morning, impossible to see unless you looked directly at it, but impossible, too, to ever fully dispel. And so you live with it, as you live with all things, with the ache of your muscles after a day's labor, with the rawness of your hands in winter, with the dull, unspoken knowledge that much of what you feared was as inevitable as it was inexplicable. And though you continued to wash in the river, to fetch water from the well, to glance occasionally at your reflection in the sheen of a cooking pot or the flicker of a puddle after rain, you did so now with the quiet, wary awareness that your reflection was not merely a passive likeness, but a part of you that could be taken, that could leave you at any moment, and that in the end, perhaps, the only true mark of your existence was the tenuous, ever-threatened persistence of the image that, look back at you. The winter came early that year. sweeping through the village with merciless efficiency that left little room for preparation or reprieve, sealing the earth in a brittle crust of frost and driving the animals to huddle together in their enclosures, their breath rising in ghostly columns into the frigid air. The river, your reluctant mirror, thickened and slow beneath the encroaching ice, its surface transforming from something pliant and mutable into something rigid, treacherous, a skin stretched taut over hidden depths that now seemed all the more dangerous for being obscured. Where once the water had offered at least the illusion of movement, of escape, it now stood still as a blade, reflecting not only your image but also your isolation, your entrapment within a season, and a life that allowed for no digressions and no indulgences. You had always feared winter, not only for its obvious threats, the hunger that gnawed more insistently as supplies dwindled, the illnesses that crept quietly from house to house, the nights that pressed in like an ever-tightening fist, but also for what it did to time itself, how it slowed the world to a crawl and left you alone with your thoughts, with the inescapable awareness of your own body and its vulnerabilities. In summer, you could lose yourself in the sheer relentlessness of the work, the planting, the harvesting, the mending of tools and fences. In winter, there was only the waiting, the cold hours spent tending small, futile fires and watching as your breath clouded the air in front of you like a signal of your own slow erosion. And yet, perversely, it was in this season of stasis and scarcity that you found yourself returning most often to the riverbank, drawn there not by necessity but by something else, something hard to name, a compulsion that grew more insistent with each passing day as the ice thickened and the snow accumulated in silent, suffocating drifts. You told yourself that you wanted to check the traps you had set along the river's edge, to ensure that no foolish animal had stumbled into one and died needlessly, its body wasted. But you knew, even as you muttered these rationalizations aloud to no one, that they were lies, that what you sought in those bitter excursions was not food or utility, but confrontation with the river, with your reflection, with the image that now haunted you more persistently than ever. For in the ice, the reflection was different. It did not shift and ripple as it did in water. It did not fracture with every stray breeze or tremble at the brush of your hand. It was fixed static, as though etched into the very surface of the world itself. And this permanence both terrified and enthralled you. You would kneel cautiously at the edge, your breath fogging the surface, your gloved hand hovering just above the ice as you stared down into the frozen likeness of your own face, the hollows beneath your eyes deepened by the thinness that the season imposed on all bodies, the cracks in your lips mirrored by the fissures in the ice itself, the raw redness of your knuckles an angry counterpoint to the pale, almost bluish tone of your skin. At times, you would press your fingertips gently to the ice, half expecting it to give way, to fracture beneath the slight pressure, to release the dark, cold water beneath, and with it your reflection, returning it to the fluid ambiguity you had always known. But the ice held, resolute and unyielding, offering you no such release, forcing you instead to confront the terrible clarity of your own image preserved in its crystalline grip. You wondered, not for the first time, whether this was what the Venetian glass was like, whether those who gaze into such perfect surfaces experienced the same mixture of revelation and revulsion, the same awareness that what they saw was both themselves and something else, something alien, an approximation too precise to be fully trusted. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the village retreated further into itself. The communal spaces abandoned save for the occasional exchange of firewood or salted meat, the usual rhythms of gossip and obligation suspended beneath the oppressive weight of survival. You, too, withdrew, spending more time in the cramped confines of your hovel, nursing the slow-burning fire and mending what could be mended, discarding what could not. But always, the river called to you, and you answered, venturing out into the cold not because you needed it, but because you could not bear not to, because the frozen reflection had become, somehow, the only proof you had that you still existed in a world otherwise rendered numb and featureless by snow and silence. It was during one such visit, in the pale gray light of an afternoon that felt no different from evening or morning, that you noticed the first crack in the ice, a thin, jagged line that snaked across the surface just above where your reflection should have been. You stared at it for a long time, your breath quickening in a way that had nothing to do with exertion, and everything to do with the sudden, visceral sense that something had shifted, that the boundary you had come to rely upon, the boundary between surface and depth, between image and substance, was beginning to fail. You reached out instinctively, tracing the crack with your gloved finger, and felt the faintest give beneath the pressure, a subtle but unmistakable reminder that nothing, not even the frozen river, could resist the slow, inevitable pull of time and entropy. In the days that followed, more cracks appeared, spreading like veins across the ice, rendering your reflection increasingly fragmented, as though the very surface of your identity was shattering in slow motion. You found yourself returning to the river more frequently, compelled not by the desire to see your reflection whole, but by the need to witness its disintegration, to catalog each new fracture, each new distortion, as though by doing so you might come to understand something fundamental about the nature of reflection itself, about the impossibility of preserving an image against the relentless forces of change. You thought then of the reflection thief, of the stories the children told in warmer months, and wondered whether the slow fracturing of your image was not some supernatural theft, but simply the natural order asserting itself, reclaiming from you the illusion of permanence you had, however briefly, dared to entertain. You wondered whether the true thief was not some spectral figure slipping through cracks of your home at night, but rather the season itself, the cold, the ice, the inevitable thaw that would come with the spring and erase not only your reflection, but perhaps even your compulsion to seek it. And so you watched, day after day, as the cracks widened, as the ice thinned, as the water beneath began once more to assert its movement, slow at first, but gradually more insistent, breaking to the fissures in small, dark patches that swallowed your fragmented image piece by piece. There was no single moment of collapse, no dramatic shattering of the surface into 1,000 shards, only the quiet, patient undoing of the ice's grip, the steady return of the river to its more familiar state of flux and instability. By the time the first true thaw came, the snow retreating in muddy rivulets, and the air warming enough that you no longer needed to layer every piece of clothing you owned, the ice had all but vanished, leaving only the river's dark, restless body, its surface once again too fluid to hold reflection for long. You knelt at the bank, as you always did, and leaned over the water, expecting to feel the usual mix of unease and recognition at the sight of your own face. But instead you saw only movement, only the relentless passage of water carrying away the last brittle remnants of the season that had made it, for a time, a mirror. You sat there for a long time, longer than you intended, longer than was practical, your legs growing stiff in the lingering cold as you watched the river flow past, indifferent as ever to your presence, to your reflection, to the months you had spent locked in this peculiar, silent dialogue with it. You thought about all the images you had seen there over the years, your childhood face, rounder and more trusting, your adolescent sneer, your adult weariness, and now this absence, this refusal of the river to offer you even the most fleeting acknowledgement of your existence. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of this refusal, you felt a strange sense of peace, of release, as though the river's return of motion had absolved you of the need to seek yourself within it, as though it had reminded you, gently but firmly, that reflection is not a guarantee but a privilege, a fragile, temporary alignment of light and surface, an eye that can never be relied upon but only stumbled into, accidentally and briefly, before it dissolves once more into the greater, indifferent flow of the world. You stood then, brushing the mud from your knees, and turned back toward the village, toward the chores and obligations that awaited you, your body moving with the same habitual efficiency as always, but your mind somehow quieter, less burdened by the compulsions that had driven you to the river so relentlessly all winter. And as you walked, you realized that though the ice had broken, though the mirror had melted away, the image of yourself that it had once held remained, not as a fixed, unchanging likeness, but as a memory, as an understanding that reflection is not something granted or taken, but something made, continually and imperfectly, in the spaces between seeing and being seen. The spring did not arrive gently, nor did it unfold with the gradual promise of renewal that the priest was always so fond of describing from the pulpit, his voice lilting with rehearsed benevolence about green shoots and lambs bleeding and the eternal cycle of death yielding inevitably to life. No, spring in your village was a violent, aggressive thing, a rupture rather than a rebirth, a raw, wet wound torn open the earth as the frost receded and the ground heaved up all that had hoarded and hidden under the hard crust of winter, rotted vegetation, the carcasses of animals that hadn't survived the freeze, stones uprooted by ice, and occasionally more unsettling remnants, bones you could not easily categorize, scraps of cloth or leather half buried in the mud, artifacts of lives. Interrupted or simply forgotten, the river swelled first, fattened by the meltwater cascading down from the hills, its banks quickly overrun with thick, clinging muck that swallowed boots whole and left a stench of decay lingering in the air long after the water had receded. The paths that had been so compact and navigable in winter dissolved into treacherous channels, and your once predictable route to the water's edge became a series of guesses and calculations, each step a potential surrender to the sucking pull of the earth beneath. Yet you went, as you always did, drawn by the same compulsions that had guided your steps all winter. Not merely the practical necessity of fetching water or checking traps, but the deeper, more abstract need to return to the place where you had, for so long, measured yourself against your reflection, against the shifting, often treacherous image of your own face in the river's mutable skin. But the river had changed too, no longer placid, frozen mirror that had offered you the stark, crystalline certainty of your reflection etched in ice, but now a roiling, chaotic force, thick with debris and sediment, its surface broken and churning, incapable of holding any image for more than the barest instant before swallowing it into the opaque turbulence below. You stood at the bank, your eyes scanning the water for some stable patch, some brief clearing where you might glimpse yourself once more, but there was nothing, only the constant movement, the relentless tearing apart and recombining of forms that made it impossible to distinguish your reflection from the river itself. In those first weeks of the thaw, you felt disoriented, unmoored by the river's refusal to give you back your image, as though the mirror you had come to rely upon, however uneasily, had been shattered beyond repair, leaving you with no way to anchor yourself, to confirm your presence in the world through that simplest and most ancient of acts, the gaze meeting its own twin. You found yourself lingering at the water's edge longer than necessary, your chores neglected as you waited, sometimes for hours, for the river to calm, for the surface to settle enough that you might catch even the faintest echo of your face. But it did not, and with each passing day, the realization set it more firmly, like a dull ache settling into your bones, that the season had claimed not only the ice, but also the fragile, fleeting relationship you had cultivated with your own reflection. The other villagers, of course, took no notice of this internal loss, preoccupied as they were with the more immediate and tangible demands of season, repairing roofs and fences battered by winter storms, clearing the fields for planting, coaxing new life from soil that only weeks before it seemed as barren and impenetrable as stone. Their movements were purposeful, their conversations filled with familiar complaints and predictions that marked the annual transition from one form of labor to another, and you move among them as expected, performing your share of the work, responding to greetings and instructions with the appropriate nods and grunts. But all the while, your mind remained tethered to the river, to the absence that now defined it more than any presence. It was in this context of absence, of the river's refusal to reflect, that you began to think more often and more intensely about what it meant to exist without that verification, to live without the constant reassurance of your own image mirrored back to you. For so long, you had associated the act of reflection with identity itself, had measured the contours of your face not merely as a vanity, but as a ritual of recognition, a necessary gesture through which you could remind yourself of who you were, of where the boundary between your body and the world lay. Without it, you found yourself questioning not only your appearance, but your very coherence as a self, wondering if you were now more diffuse, more scattered, like the fragments of wood and leaves caught in the river's current, carried off in directions you could no longer predict or control. At night, when the labor of the day left you too exhausted to venture back to the river, but too restless to sleep, you would lie awake in the darkness of your hovel and try to conjure your own image from memory, piecing together the familiar landmarks of your face, the curve of your jaw, the slope of your nose, the angle at which your brows furrowed when you concentrated. But even these internal approximations felt increasingly unreliable, increasingly abstract, as though without the external confirmation of the mirror, they were susceptible to erosion, to slow but inevitable dissolution. You began to understand, in a way that you had not fully grasped before, that reflection was not simply about sight, but about existence, about anchoring oneself in the world to the recursive act of seeing and being seen, and that without it, you risk becoming not merely invisible but intangible, a presence so faint as to be indistinguishable from absence. And yet, despite this growing awareness of what had been lost, you found that life, as it always does, continued, indifferent to your internal reckonings. The seeds were planted, The animals tended, the paths repaired, and slowly the village emerged from its winter hibernation into the rough, provisional vitality of spring. The children, their cheeks flushed with the novelty of warm air and longer days, resumed their games near the river, skirting its swollen banks with a reckless glee that you envied and feared in equal measure. The old men returned to their seats by the fire, spinning the same tired stories with a renewed sense of purpose, as though the mere act of surviving another winter conferred upon them the right to retell and embellish the past however they saw fit. You moved among these scenes as a participant, but increasingly also as an observer, your sense of detachment sharpened by the lingering absence of your reflection, by the persistent feeling that without it, you occupied a space just slightly out of sync with the world around you, visible perhaps to others, but increasingly opaque to yourself. And yet, in this opacity, there was also a strange kind of freedom, a loosening of the rigid self-awareness that had for so long governed your movements, your gestures, your very conception of who you were. Without the mirror, you were less defined, less circumscribed, and while this lack of definition sometimes felt like loss, it also opened up the possibility of being something other than what you had always seen reflected back at you. It was late in the season, when the river had finally receded to something approaching its usual bounds, and the fields were green with the first hopeful shoots of the new crop, that you ventured back to the water's edge one evening, more out of habit than intention. The sun was low, casting long, slanting shadows across the surface of the river, and for the first time in months, the water was still enough that it formed a smooth, unbroken plain, dark and gleaming like the obsidian shard the merchant had once shown you. You stood there for a long time, your heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread, before finally leaning over and looking down. And there it was. Your reflection, faint but unmistakable, emerging from the water like a figure stepping out of fog, its features blurred by the dusk but coherent nonetheless. You stared at it, at yourself, at the image you had been denied all season, and felt not the triumphant rush of reunion you might have expected, but something more muted, more complex, a recognition tempered by the knowledge that this image was not permanent, not reliable, that it could and would vanish again with the next rain, the next flood, the next winter. You realized in that moment that reflection was not a stable possession, but a transient phenomenon, a fleeting alignment of circumstances that you could neither command nor predict. And as you straightened, turning away from the river and toward the village now glowing softly in the evening light, you carried with you not the certainty of your own image, but the understanding of its fragility, of its impermanence, and with that, renewed appreciation for quiet, persistent fact of your existence beyond the mirror, beyond the reflection, in the unglamorous, unrecorded acts of living that defined your days far more enduringly than any image ever could. By the time summer unfurled its thick, oppressive heat across the village, the river had long since lost its swollen, unruly violence, shrinking back into more familiar, lazy serpent winding to the fields as it had always done, indifferent to the transient dramas that unfolded along its banks. The water now moved with a deceptive gentleness, its surface often so still that it seemed less a living thing and more an inert slab of dull metal laid out beneath the unrelenting sun, interrupted only occasionally by the languid sweep of a fish's tail or the iridescent skimming of an insect too light to trouble the calm. The days stretched endlessly, their hours heavy with the drone of cicadas and the dense, syrupy air that pressed against your skin, making every task feel like an ordeal and every moment of respite a hard-earned reprieve. It was in these long, slow hours that your relationship with the river, with your reflection, began to shift again, not with the abruptness of winter's violent severing or spring's chaotic flooding, but with the quiet, inexorable persistence of erosion, of gradual wearing down, as unnoticed and inevitable as the rounding of a stone by centuries of patient water. You found yourself returning to the river's edge more often, not with a desperate compulsion that had driven you to the winter, nor the anxious longing of spring, but with something closer to resignation, as though accepting that the river would always be there, that your reflection would sometimes be visible and sometimes not, and that neither condition carried with it any particular meaning beyond the simple fact of its occurrence. The villagers, too, moved differently now, their bodies slackened by the heat, their voices softer, their tempers shorter, but their quarrels quicker to dissipate, as though even conflict required more energy than anyone could reasonably be expected to expend. The market still bustled, the fields still demanded their due, But everything unfolded at half its usual pace, smoothed over by the haze of summer in a way that dulled both joy and suffering into something more muted, more bearable. You watched all of this with a detached curiosity, as though you were observing the slow motion of a machine that no longer required your full engagement to operate. But it was in the quiet, solitary moments, when the village had retreated into the shade of its huts and you stood alone by the riverbank, that you began to notice something new. Something that at first seemed too subtle to name, but which over time revealed itself with increasing clarity. A sense of dislocation not from the river, but from the reflection itself, as though the image that stared back at you from the placid surface was less a representation of yourself and more an autonomous entity, a double that existed parallel to you, but no longer in perfect synchronicity. You would lean over the water, your elbows resting on your knees, your gaze steady, and for a moment, everything would appear as it always had. The familiar contours of your face, the dark smudges beneath your eyes, the mess of your hair untamed by the sweat and labor of the day. But then, in the stillness, you would notice some infinitesimal discrepancy, a flicker in the eyes that did not correspond to your own, a tightening of the jaw that you had not consciously enacted, a shift in posture so subtle yet so distinctly alien that it made your skin prickle with a slow, creeping unease. At first, you dismissed these moments as tricks of the light, as the understandable consequence of staring too long into a surface that was, by its very nature, unreliable and prone to distortion. But as the days wore on and the incidents accumulated, you could no longer maintain such comfortable explanations. The reflection, you realized with a cold clarity, was no longer simply reflecting. It was, in some way you could not fully articulate, acting, existing with a degree of independence that defied both logic and everything you had ever been taught about the relationship between the self and its image. You began to test it, at first cautiously and then with growing urgency, raising a hand slowly, watching as the reflection followed suit with the same languid grace you had always known, then abruptly changing direction, moving your arm in a sudden sharp arc or twisting your torso with a speed that left you breathless, only find that the reflection sometimes lagged, sometimes anticipated, and sometimes did not follow at all. These deviations were never dramatic, no grotesque inversions or blatant contradictions, but they were enough, in their quiet defiance, to convince you that something fundamental had shifted, that the reflection was no longer content to be a passive echo, but was instead staking its own claim to existence. The realization filled you not with the fear you might have expected, but with a kind of grim fascination, as though witnessing a slow but inevitable process of separation, like a limb being severed not with sudden cut, but through the gradual, numbing pressure of a tourniquet. You did not tell anyone, of course. How could you? The words for such an experience did not exist within the vocabulary of the village, where reflections were either dismissed as inconsequential or feared as omens, but never considered as independent beings capable of their own intentions. To speak of such things would invite not understanding but suspicion, perhaps even accusations of madness, and so you kept your observations to yourself, carrying them silently like a secret wound. As the summer deepened and the days grew even longer, the boundary between you and your reflection continued to blur and fray in ways that left you increasingly uncertain of where you ended and it began. You would catch yourself wondering, as you went about your chores, whether the reflection was watching you even when you were not watching it, whether it existed only within the confines of the river or whether it had learned, somehow, to inhabit other surfaces, the glint of sunlight on the edge of a scythe, the brief shimmer of sweat on your forearm, the dull gleam of a pot left out to dry. The possibility that it might now exist independently of the river both terrified and intrigued you, suggesting as it did that the act of reflection was not merely an incidental property of certain surfaces, but a condition that, once established, could persist and proliferate, replicating itself across the landscape of your life in ways you could neither predict nor control. You began to see reflections everywhere, not always of your face, but forms and movements that seemed uncannily familiar, as though the reflection, once confined to the river's surface, had now slipped its moorings and was exploring the world on its own terms, leaving traces of itself scattered across the village like breadcrumbs marking a path you could not yet discern. This new awareness altered your relationship not only to the river but to the village itself, rendering every interaction, every moment of solitude, charged with a latent possibility of encounter. You found yourself moving more cautiously, more deliberately, as though trying to outmaneuver a presence that you could neither see nor escape. And yet you also felt an unexpected sense of companionship in this unseen doubling, as though for the first time in your life you were not entirely alone in your own body, in your own mind. And so the summer passed, not with the lazy indifference that you had anticipated, but with a taut, electric undercurrent that made even the most mundane tasks, the mending of fence, the drawing of water, the binding of sheaves, a kind of ritual, a performance enacted for an audience you could not locate, but whose gaze you felt nonetheless. You began to wonder whether this was, in fact, the true nature of reflection, not simply the passive replication of form, but the establishment of a relationship, a dialogue between the self and something other, something that, once acknowledged, could never be fully disentangled from the fabric of your existence. By the time the first cool winds of autumn began to stir the leaves and the days once again shortened into something more manageable, you realized that your understanding of the reflection had undergone a transformation as complete and irreversible as any seasonal change. It was no longer, as it had once been, a simple question of appearance, of seeing or not seeing your face in the water, but had instead become a matter of presence, of cohabitation with a part of yourself that was at once familiar and alien, comforting and unsettling, indispensable and yet potentially dangerous. You did not know what the coming months would bring, whether the reflection would continue to assert its independence or whether it would recede once more into the passive, predictable behavior you had long assumed was its natural state. But you did know this, that the act of looking had changed you irrevocably, that you could no longer approach the river, or any surface of that matter, without the awareness that what you saw might not be simply yourself, but something more, something other, something that existed because of you, but not entirely within your control. And with this knowledge came a kind of weary acceptance, a recognition that to live in the world is always, in some sense, to live in relation to one's own reflection, to navigate the complex, shifting interplay between self and image, between what is seen and what sees, between the body that moves through space and the myriad echoes it leaves behind. You turned away from the river then, your eyes lingering for a moment on the placid surface that had, for so long, served as both mirror and confidant, and then you walked back toward the village, toward the waning summer light, carrying with you not a reflection but the memory of one, and the understanding that this, perhaps more than anything, was what it meant to be human, to be seen to see, and to never fully know the difference between the two. By the time the first leaves began to wither at their edges, curling inward as if retreating from the air itself, you had grown so accustomed to the ambiguous, persistent presence of your reflection that its absence no longer startled you, but instead left behind a quiet, almost imperceptible ache, as though a limb you no longer possessed still itched beneath your skin. The river, once the singular site of your confrontation with yourself, had receded again to a narrower channel, its banks lined with brittle grasses, and the skeletal remains of plants that had flourished so violently only weeks before. The water ran clear but shallow, tracing a meandering path through stones polished smooth by centuries of repetition, reflecting now only fragments of the world above, a sliver of sky, the stark line of a branch stripped bare, and occasionally the briefest, most insubstantial suggestion of your own form. It was in this season, when the world began its slow descent into decay, that you came to understand reflection not as an event, but as a cycle, something less akin to a mirror and more like the breath that fogs it, present and then gone, visible and then erased, a consequence of the inevitable flux of all things rather than a fixed relationship between you and the surface that once received you so faithfully. You realize that for all the intensity with which you had once sought your reflection, as proof of your own coherence, of your distinct presence in the world, it had always been, at best, a temporary alliance, subject to the whims of light, of water, of season and circumstance. And in recognizing this, you began, however reluctantly, to loosen your grip on the need for it, to allow yourself to exist outside the constant compulsion to see and be seen. Yet there remained a residual reflex, a habit too deeply ingrained to be shed entirely. And so you continued your visits to the river, even as the days shortened and the air sharpened, bringing with it the first hints of the cold that would soon return to clamp down on the land with the same brute inevitability it always did. You stood at the water's edge, boots rooted in the soft, damp soil, and watched as the river moved indifferently past you, carrying with it the debris of summer, the shattered husks of insects, the stray feathers of birds migrating south, leaves that had detached too early or too late, their timing rendered irrelevant by the strength of the current. It was there, amid this detritus, that you began to see not reflections but layers, not the clear and singular image of your face, but a more diffuse and complex arrangement of elements that together constituted something far closer to the truth of your existence. Your shape blur among the reeds, your color lost against the gray of the sky reflected in the water, your movement indistinguishable from the gentle ripple of the current. In this dissolution, there was, paradoxically, a kind of comfort, a release from the burden of distinctness, of the constant need to define yourself against the world rather than as a part of it. You began to think more often about the stories you had heard as a child, those of spirits inhabiting the river, of ancestors trapped beneath its surface, of souls that, once reflected in the water, could never fully depart but lingered there, watching, waiting, woven into the perpetual motion of the current. These stories, which had once seemed little more than the indulgent fantasies of frightened minds, now struck you with a renewed resonance, not as literal truths, but as metaphors for the very experience you are now living. The gradual, inevitable merging of the self with its surroundings, the blurring of the boundary between who you were and where you were, between the reflection and the thing reflected. This new understanding extended beyond the river itself, inflecting your perception of the entire village, of its people and their movements, their routines repeated with such consistency that they, too, seemed like reflections of something larger, something more enduring than any individual life. You saw it in the way the blacksmith's hammer rose and fell in perfect cadence, the way the baker's hand shaped loaves without conscious thought, the way the children ran the same worn paths through the fields, their laughter echoing off stones smoothed by generations of footsteps. These patterns, these repetitions, mirror themselves across time and space, rendering the distinction between the singular and the collective increasingly tenuous in your mind. And in this dissolution of boundaries, you began to find, if not peace, then at least a kind of quiet acquiescence, an acceptance of the fact that your reflection, however much you had once pursued it, however fiercely you had once clung to it as evidence of your separateness and your significance, was ultimately no more permanent or essential than the image of a cloud on the surface of the water, lovely for a moment and then gone, leaving behind only the faintest memory of its passing. You came to understand that the river had never been a mirror in the way you had once believed, never an instrument designed to offer you a true and reliable portrait of yourself, but rather a collaborator in the ongoing process of your own becoming and unbecoming, a partner in a dance that neither of you led, but that both of you performed nonetheless. This shift in perspective altered not only how you saw yourself, but also how you approached the rituals of your daily life. You moved through the village with a new lightness, unburdened by the relentless scrutiny you had once imposed upon your own image, engaging with others not as a reflection of how you might appear to them, but simply as another presence among many, one node in the complex, interwoven network of relationships and obligations that define community. You found yourself speaking more freely, laughing more easily, offering help without the self-consciousness that had once accompanied every gesture, every interaction colored by the awareness of how it might be perceived or remembered. And yet, even as this newfound freedom took root, there remained moments of lingering doubt, of sudden, inexplicable longing for the old certainty of your reflection, for the comfort of knowing, however imperfectly, what you looked like, what you were, where you began and ended. These moments would catch you off guard. In the quiet spaces between tasks, in the solitary walks along the river when the fog hung low and the water's surface was so still it seemed almost sacrilegious to disturb it with your presence. In these moments, you would sometimes kneel, almost without thinking, and lean over the water, searching for a glimpse of that familiar face, for the reassurance of the self you had spent so much of your life trying to pin down in the trembling mirror of the river. But more often than not, the surface offered you nothing but the pale reflection of the sky or the flickering shadows of birds passing overhead, and you would straighten with a small, resigned smile, acknowledging that whatever image you might have expected to see there no longer existed in the way you once believed it did. You understood now that the self is not something that can be captured in a reflection, no matter how clear or precise, but is instead something that emerges in the spaces between reflection and action, between being seen and simply being. As the season continued its inexorable decline, the leaves transforming from green to gold or brittle brown, you found yourself visiting the river less frequently, not out of avoidance, but out of a sense that there was nothing more to be found there that you had not already discovered. The reflection, the relationship, the ritual All had served their purpose, had carried you through the long, difficult process of coming to terms with your own impermanence, with the fluidity not just of the water, but of your own existence. And so, on what would turn out to be your final visit of the season, you stood at the river's edge one last time, watching as the wind swept across its surface, raising small, playful waves that broke the reflection of the sky into 1,000 shimmering fragments. You did not lean over, did not search for your face in the water, but simply stood there, feeling the cool air against your skin, listening to the quiet murmur of the current, and acknowledging in that moment that you had finally let go of the need to see yourself reflected there. You turned away then, walking back toward the village with a steady, unhurried pace, carrying with you not an image but a memory, not a reflection but an understanding, that to live fully is not to fix oneself in a mirror, but to move through the world as a part of it, to accept the inevitability of change, of dissolution, and to find in that acceptance not despair but a deeper, quieter form of grace. The first frost came not with a thunderous arrival, not with the dramatic crack of ice splitting bark or the loud collapse of sodden leaves, but silently, stealthily, a thin veil of crystalline breath that slipped into the village under cover of night and laid itself down across every surface as delicately as a sheet laid over a corpse. You noticed it at dawn, when your boots scuffed against the brittle grass and the pale sun, struggling feebly through a scrim of low clouds, caught the frost in just the right angle, making it shimmer briefly before melting into oblivion. It was in that quiet, glinting dissolution that you felt the season's true pivot. Not in the arbitrary date chosen by the priest to mark the beginning of winter, or the premature gathering of firewood by the more cautious villagers, but in that fragile moment when the earth itself seemed to exhale one last sigh of warmth before surrendering to cold. The river responded first, as it always did, its slow-moving surface growing sluggish beneath the accumulating sheets of ice that thickened not from the center but from the edges, creeping inward like a silent siege. You had not visited the river in weeks by then, having finally broken the compulsive routine that had structured so much of your life through the prior seasons. But the frost drew you back with the inevitability of familiar, unfinished conversation. You stood at the bank, your breath pooling visibly before you, watching as the ice sealed over more and more of the water, locking it down in increments so subtle you could almost convince yourself that it wasn't happening, until you blinked and realized that the space where your reflection might have once appeared was now entirely occupied by a dull, opaque crust. You crouched, gloved fingers brushing the edge of the ice, testing its firmness. It held. The river was transforming again, moving away from the chaotic, dissolving energy of autumn into the static, suspended state of winter, and you recognized with a kind of hollow inevitability that your reflection would not return to this surface for many months, if it returned at all. But this time, unlike all the seasons before, there was no panic in the realization, no desperate urge to capture or preserve the image before it vanished. Instead, there was a muted acknowledgement, as understated as the frost itself, that this was the nature of things, to come and go, to appear and recede, to reflect and then to obscure. The village, too, had begun its descent into the rituals of winter, the pace of life contracting as days shortened and the air thickened with wood smoke and the sharp, metallic scent of snow that had not yet fallen, but which everyone knew was imminent. People moved with a different kind of purpose now, not the frantic urgency of spring planting or the weary endurance of summer harvest, but a slow, deliberate efficiency, as if every action carried within it an awareness of the energy it would consume and the scarcity of what remained to replenish it. You fell into this rhythm as well, chopping wood with methodical precision, patching leaks in the thatch, stacking stores of grain and salted meat with the quiet understanding that each preserved item was not just sustenance, but a hedge against the void that winter always threatened to bring. And yet, even as you immersed yourself in these tasks, you could not help but notice how the absence of your reflection had altered the quality of your engagement with the world around you. Where once you had measured your own presence against the image the river returned to you, calibrating your sense of self through that slippery, unreliable lens, you now moved through space with a different kind of awareness, one that relied less on visual confirmation and more on the haptic feedback of labor, on the weight of the axe in your hands, the roughness of rope against your palms, the ache of muscle earned through repetition, rather than observation. You realize in these long, darkening days that reflection had never truly been about seeing yourself so much as about assuring yourself that you existed, that your life had dimension and texture and consequence beyond the invisible interiority of thought and breath. Without the river's mirror to provide that assurance, you have been forced, however reluctantly, to find it elsewhere, in the materiality of your environment, in the interlocking systems of work and rest and survival that, for all their mundanity, offer the kind of stability that reflection never could. There was a certain irony in this, you thought, that the very thing you had once feared, the loss of your reflection, had ultimately revealed to you a more resilient foundation upon which to ground your existence. But this newfound solidity did not come without its own peculiar griefs, its own quiet reckonings. For all that you had come to distrust of reflection, to recognize its inherent instability and potential for distortion, there remained a part of you, a vestigial instinct cultivated over years, that longed for the simple affirmation it once provided, for the immediate, if illusory, confirmation that you were still here, still recognizably yourself. This longing surfaced most acutely in the moments when you caught accidental glimpses of yourself in other reflective surfaces, the faint sheen of ice on a window pane, the distorted echo of your face in the hammered curve of a metal basin, the ghostly outline that sometimes materialized in the darkened glass of an unlit lantern. These glimpses, so brief and so incomplete, serve less as affirmations and more as reminders of absence, of the way in which your relationship to your own image had been irrevocably altered by the cycles of the river and the seasons, and your own evolving understanding of what it meant to be a self capable of being reflected. You began to think of your reflection less as a faithful companion, and more as a visitor, a transient presence that arrived and departed according to conditions beyond your control, its appearance governed not by your need, but by the inscrutable interplay of light, water, temperature, and time. In this way, your reflection came to resemble more closely the rhythms of nature itself. The migration of birds overhead in V-shaped formations so precise they seemed almost designed, the emergence of mushrooms in the damp undergrowth after rain, the first brittle crack of ice forming overnight on the surface of a forgotten bucket left outside. These were not phenomena you could summon or prolong at will. They simply occurred, and your role was not to command them but to witness them, to acknowledge their presence when they arrived and to accept their absence when they inevitably departed. The first snowfall came late, long after frost had made its intentions clear, and arrived not as a gentle dusting, but as a relentless, suffocating barrage, blanketing the village in a depth of white so total that it erased the familiar contours of the landscape, transforming paths into undifferentiated drifts and fields into vast, featureless expanses. The river, already choked by ice, disappeared entirely beneath this new layer, rendered invisible and, to all practical purposes, irrelevant until thaw many months hence. You stood at its edge, or at least where you calculated its edge to be, guided not by any visible marker, but by memory and instinct, and you felt the peculiar disorientation that comes when a place so intimately familiar becomes, through the sheer force of seasonal transformation, utterly alien. The river was gone, and with it any possibility of reflection, any chance of seeing your face or your form mirrored back to you until the world softened and melted and allowed such things to occur once more. And in this erasure, there was a final kind of lesson, one that you had perhaps been moving toward all along, but had only now fully arrived at. That to depend on reflection as a means of knowing oneself is to tether your identity to forces forever beyond your control, to make your sense of being contingent upon a surface that can freeze or flood, clear or cloud, reflect or refuse at a whim. The river had taught you this not through instruction but through experience, through the repeated cycles of presence and absence, of appearance and disappearance, until at last you understood that the self you sought in its mirror was always provisional, always subject to the same elemental shifts as the water itself. You turned away then, walking back toward the village through the deep, dragging snow, your breath rasping in your chest with the effort of each step, but your mind oddly light, unburdened by the old compulsions that had for so long driven you to seek out your reflection at every opportunity. You knew now that there would be no reflection waiting for you until the spring, and perhaps not even then, depending on the whims of the river and the conditions of the world, but this knowledge no longer filled you with the dread or the emptiness it once had. Instead, it left you with a kind of quiet, austere clarity, that to exist is not to be reflected, but simply to be, to move through the world as part of its larger, unknowable patterns, to accept that some seasons offer mirrors while others offer only the blind, indifferent face of ice and snow, and that both conditions are not only inevitable, but, in their own way, necessary. And with this clarity, You walked on, leaving behind the buried river, the dormant reflection, and stepping steadily into the long, silent embrace of winter. The days contracted into small, brittle increments of light, each sunrise a reluctant gesture that barely lifted the shadows from the corners of your home before yielding once more to long, suffocating dark that stretched for hours beyond counting. The village folded in on itself. Doors barred against the cold, voices subdued to the barest whispers of necessity as bodies huddled close to whatever warmth could be summoned from hearths built too small and wood piles stacked too low. Outside, the world was mute and motionless, smothered beneath a relentless expanse of snow so uniform that it obliterated not only paths and landmarks, but also the very memory of movement, of change, of time as something other than the slow erosion of life beneath the weight of ice. You adapted as you always did, more by instinct than intention, wrapping yourself in layers so thick that your body became little more than a shape within which the act of surviving occurred with mechanical regularity. Your hands, chapped raw and cracked 100 places, learn again how to work in gloves too stiff for fine tasks, but essential against the kind of cold that gnaws not just at skin, but at the marrow beneath. Your steps shortened, your speech economized in nods and grunts, your mind dulled by the steady, oppressive rhythm of days that demanded everything and offered nothing in return. And yet, within this bleak, airless season, there remained a peculiar kind of intimacy between you and the river, a relationship now sustained not through sight, but through memory and through the knowledge, both comforting and unbearable, that it continued beneath the layers of snow and ice even in your absence. You could no longer visit it, could no longer stand at its edge and trace the slow evolution of your reflection in its mutable surface, but you knew it was there, locked in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the inevitable shift that would awaken it once more. This absence was different now, less an ache for what was lost and an acknowledgement of what simply was, the understanding that some things remain beyond reach, beyond intervention, beyond the scope of even your most fervent desire. In this enforced distance, you came to recognize the river not as a place, but as a process, not as a surface that either granted or denied your reflection, but as a continuous force, an entity indifferent to your presence yet profoundly entangled with your existence. It shaped the village's geography, dictated the rhythms of its agriculture, determined the success or failure of its trade routes when thaw allowed for transport or flood demanded rebuilding. And though now buried and silent, it was no less present, no less potent, than in the seasons when it roared freely or lay smooth and still beneath the summer sun. You realized in the slow hours spent staring at the flickering light of your hearth that what had first drawn you to the river all those months ago had not been the reflection itself but the promise it offered. That in its surface you might find some stable, knowable version of yourself, some image unmarred by the doubts and contradictions that otherwise inflected your every thought and action. But now, severed from that surface, you saw with a clarity that startled even you that no such stable version had ever existed, that your reflection had always been a negotiation between light and water, between body and element, between what was projected and what was perceived, and that its apparent stability had been nothing more than the coincidence of favorable conditions. Freed from the compulsion to seek this illusion of stability, you found yourself turning inward in ways you never had before, your thoughts no longer fixated on the shape and fidelity of your external image, but instead circling more abstract, more difficult questions. What remained of the self when its reflection was no longer available as a reference point? How did identity persist, or did it, when divorced from the means by which it was most commonly affirmed? Was existence itself dependent upon recognition, upon being seen, or did it possess an autonomy that transcended such fragile, circumstantial validations? These questions accompanied you through the long, silent days, threading through your consciousness as insistently as the cold that seeped through the walls and floorboards no matter how fiercely you stoked the fire. They did not offer themselves up for resolution, but instead demanded to be lived with, to be endured as part of the season's broader imposition of patience, of endurance, of submission to forces immeasurably larger than yourself. And you bore them as you bore the winter itself. Stoically, silently, with a resignation that felt neither noble nor tragic, but simply necessary. At times, when the wind howled most violently through the village, rattling shutters and sending loose shingles skittering across frozen rooftops, you would lie awake and listen, imagining that beneath this auditory onslaught the river still moved, still whispered in its subterranean channel beneath the ice, a sound so low and so distant that it was indistinguishable from memory or dream. In these moments, you felt an almost unbearable tenderness for the river, for the years it had spent offering you its surface, its shifting reflections, its mutable companionship, and for the way it now persisted unseen, its presence no less vital for being inaccessible. The village, for its part, continued as it always did through the winter. Marriages arranged, animals slaughtered, children born and named and swaddled against the cold. These events unfolded with a matter-of-fact inevitability, punctuated occasionally by misfortunes, a roof collapsing under the weight of snow, a fire consuming an outbuilding too swiftly to be extinguished, a sickness that spread through a family before a cure could be found. Each incident was absorbed into the collective memory of the village, another story to be told around fires in future winters, another layer added to the sediment of communal history that, like the river, flowed continuously beneath the surface of daily life. You participated in these communal rituals as required, your presence noted but largely unremarked upon, your role within the village as stable and as predictable as the seasonal cycles that governed its existence. Yet even as you fulfilled these obligations, you carried within you the quiet, persistent awareness of your altered relationship to the river and, by extension, to yourself. This awareness did not alienate you from the community, but instead afforded you a perspective that felt simultaneously more detached and more compassionate, as though recognizing the impermanence of your own reflection had made you more attuned to the transient, provisional nature of all things. This shift manifested in small but significant ways. In the patience with which you listened to an elder recount a story you had heard 100 times before, knowing that its repetition was not a failure of memory, but a reaffirmation of continuity. In the gentleness with which you mended a neighbor's broken fence, not out of obligation, but out of a recognition of the shared vulnerability that defined all human structures, physical and emotional alike. In the way you paused during your solitary walks through the snow to watch the low winter sun cast elongated shadows across the drifts, marveling at how even in the season of apparent stasis the world continued to transform, to reflect itself in ways that required no mirror, no water, no witness. By the time the first faint hints of thaw began to appear, icicles dripping steadily from eaves, the air softening at the edges, the snow receding to reveal the bruised, matted grass beneath, you realized that you had not thought of your reflection in weeks, perhaps months. The compulsion that had once drawn you to the river's edge with such urgency had dissolved entirely, replaced by a quieter, more diffuse awareness of your place within a world that reflected itself in countless ways, each as transient and as valid as the image once granted to you by the water. When at last you ventured back to the river, its surface still partially bound by the remnant of ice, but already beginning to stir with the tentative movements of spring, you did not approach it with the same anticipatory hunger as before. Instead, you stood at a respectful distance, acknowledging its return not as the reawakening of a lost mirror, but as a continuation of a process that had never truly ceased, merely receded from your immediate perception. You watched as the water pushed against the ice, breaking it into shards that floated downstream, their jagged edges catching the light in brief, dazzling flashes before disappearing around the bend. You did not seek your reflection in these fragments. You did not kneel or lean over the water's edge in search of your face. You simply stood there, breathing in the damp, thaw-scented air, feeling the warmth of the sun on your face for the first time in months, and understanding, with a calm and unshakable certainty, that you had changed, not in some dramatic, epiphanic rupture, but in the slow, cumulative way that ice melts, that rivers shift course, that seasons give way to one another with a patience and inevitability that render even the most fervent desires and fears as little more than passing weather. And with that understanding, you turn away from the river, from the season, from the reflection you no longer required, and walk steadily back toward the village, toward a life that awaited you there, not as a reflection of yourself, but as a simple, enduring fact of your presence within it. The river, when it finally resumed its full, unencumbered flow, did so with a quiet confidence that rendered all your former anxieties about its stillness or absence almost absurd in retrospect, as though your need for it to behave as a mirror had been nothing more than a childish insistence that water should hold the shape you desired rather than obey its own inscrutable logic. It moved now with a steady, purposeful grace, neither hurried nor sluggish, as if indifferent to the fact that you had spent an entire year mapping the contours of your existence against its surface, extracting meaning from its various moods, interrogating its capacity to reflect you back to yourself as though such a thing could ever be within its purview. And standing at its bank, after all these seasons, after all these cycles of freezing and thawing, seeking and relinquishing, you realize that you no longer needed the river to answer questions that had once driven you so relentlessly to its edge. You had come here this final time not out of compulsion or curiosity, but out of something softer, something approaching gratitude, though that word felt too deliberate, too ceremonial for what you felt in your chest. A quiet recognition, perhaps, or simply an acknowledgement of the role the river had played in shaping your understanding of yourself and your place in this world. You stood there for a long time, the early spring air still sharp enough to sting your cheeks, the trees around you only just beginning to suggest a green that would soon overtake their skeletal forms, and you listened to the layered sounds of the river, the deeper, resonant gurgle of the current against submerged rocks, the higher, more delicate plash of water lapping at the muddy bank, the occasional, abrupt splash of a fish breaking the surface and vanishing again in the span of a breath. It was then that you understood something you had perhaps known all along but had only now allowed yourself to fully admit, that the river had never reflected you in the way you believed it had, that the image you had seen in its surface was never a true likeness, but always a construction, a fleeting arrangement of light and angle and perception as mutable and as temporary as the water itself. You had spent so much of your life believing that reflection was a kind of proof, a verification of your existence, but now you saw that it had always been a metaphor, a symbol onto which you had projected your longing for certainty, for stability, for some fixed point against which to measure your being. And as you watched the river move, unconcerned with your presence, carrying downstream the remnants of winter's debris, twigs, clumps of dead grass, bits of bark, you realized that you, too, were no more or less permanent than these things, that your life, your body, your thoughts, all the things you had once hoped to see confirmed in the mirror of the water, were just as subject to erosion, to dispersion, to being carried away by forces beyond your control. But this realization did not bring with it the fear or the despair that it might once have. Instead, it felt oddly liberating, as though being relieved of the need to see yourself reflected in the river had also freed you from a need to hold yourself so tightly in the shape you had always assumed was necessary for your survival. You turned away from the river then, not abruptly, but with the same deliberate grace with which it moved, and began walking back toward the village, your steps steady and unhurried, your mind quiet in a way it had not been in many months. The path was familiar now, not because you had memorized each twist and route, but because you no longer needed to interrogate its every feature for signs or symbols, for hints about who you were or where you belonged. It was just a path, and you were just a person walking along it, and that, you realized, was enough. In the village, life had resumed its seasonal cadence, as it always did, as it always would, long after you were gone, long after all who now inhabited it had been replaced by others who performed the same tasks, tell the same stories, make the same mistakes and discoveries, love and grieve and labor in the same ways. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in the morning air with its familiar rhythm. The baker's oven exhaled its fragrant breath through the open shutters. The children shrieked with laughter as they chased one another through the budding fields, their voices bright and insistent against the soft background hum of bees returning to the world after their long winter torpor. You moved among these scenes with a new kind of ease, no longer preoccupied with how you might be seen within them, no longer concerned with how your presence might be interpreted or reflected back at you. You realize now that all those years you believed you were seeking your reflection in the river, you had in fact been seeking permission to exist, to take up space, to assert your own life as something distinct and worthy of acknowledgement. But standing here, amid the ordinary, persistent life of the village, you understood that such permission had never needed to be sought, that it had always been inherent in your very existence, as natural and as unremarkable as a river's flow. And with that understanding came another, quieter one, that the story you had told yourself about your reflection, about the river, about your own identity, was just that, a story, one among many that humans tell to make sense of their lives, to impose structure and meaning on the otherwise indifferent processes of nature and time. It was a good story, perhaps even a necessary one, but it was not the only one, and its conclusion did not signify an end but simply a transition, a movement from one way of understanding yourself to another, more expansive and perhaps more compassionate. You thought then of all the times you stood at the river's edge, desperate to see yourself, to confirm that you were still there, still real, And you smiled at the memory, not with derision but with tenderness, with the kind of affection one reserves for a younger version of oneself whose fears and desires, however misguided, were genuine and deeply felt. You saw now that those moments had been important not because of what they revealed to you about your appearance, but because of what they taught you about your own capacity for longing, for reflection not just in the literal sense, but in the broader, more essential sense of thinking, of questioning, of seeking meaning beyond the immediate and the visible. And as you moved through the village, completing your tasks, exchanging greetings, participating in the quiet, ongoing rituals of daily life, you carried with you the knowledge that you no longer needed to find yourself in the river, because you had already found yourself here, in these simple, repeated actions, in the relationships you maintained, in the responsibilities you upheld, in the quiet moments of solitude when you paused to listen to the birds, or to feel the warmth of the sun on your back as you worked. The river would continue, as it always had, and so would you, though perhaps now in a way that required less searching, less striving, less of the restless, anxious energy that had once driven you to seek confirmation of your own existence in the shifting, unreliable surface of the water. You knew now that your reflection, when it appeared, would be just one of many ways in which you left your mark upon the world, and that its absence would no longer signal loss, but merely a different mode of being, a different way of inhabiting the space you had always occupied. And so, as the days lengthened and the village moved fully into the season of growth and labor and preparation for the next inevitable cycle of change, you allowed yourself to let go, not of the river itself, but of the need to see yourself within it, of the belief that your identity was something that could be captured in a single image, frozen in a moment of reflection. You understood now that you were not a reflection at all, but a presence, a force moving through the world as steadily and as surely as the river moved through its course, shaped by and shaping the landscape through which you passed. And with this final realization, you stepped fully into your life, not as a seeker of reflections, but as a participant in the ongoing, ever-changing flow of existence, carrying with you the quiet strength of one who has learned not only to see but to be seen, not only question but to accept, not only to reflect but to move forward, always forward, with the current, with the seasons, with the unending, unstoppable life of the world itself.